Hi, I'm Matthew, and welcome back to Dark Ascent. Today, I will be bringing you to the stories of Sherpas, who knew that those people were going to die, moments that I believe often start with confidence and excitement, but end in ways the mountain has already decided. From a marketing executive who refused to turn back despite fatal altitude sickness, to social media influencers who live-streamed their way into an avalanche zone that veteran guides knew would become their tomb. It was April 23, 2017, at Everest Base Camp, where the spring climbing season was entering its crucial preparation phase. The sprawling tent city at 17,600 feet buzzed with the controlled chaos of 14 expedition teams finalizing acclimatization schedules and equipment checks. Prayer flags snapped in the thin wind, their colors brilliant against the white expanse of the Khumbu Glacier. Temperatures hovered around 25 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours, cold enough that climbers moved between tents in heavy down jackets, but warm enough that the camp felt almost hospitable compared to what waited above. The air carried the familiar sense of base camp life, kerosene from cooking stoves, the sharp ozone smell of glacier ice, and the earthy smoke of juniper burned in morning pujas. Among the climbers was Deborah Mitchell, a 42-year-old real estate executive from Dallas, who had arrived in Nepal 3 weeks earlier with a mission that extended far beyond the summit. At 240 pounds and 5'6", Deborah represented something she believed Everest desperately needed, proof that high-altitude mountaineering wasn't exclusive to the lean, elite climbers who dominated expedition rosters and Instagram feeds. She had spent 18 months training for this climb, completing 2 marathons and maintaining a rigorous gym schedule that left her genuinely fit by conventional standards. What she lacked was any meaningful high-altitude experience. Deborah's path to Everest had been shaped by a divorce 2 years earlier. Her ex-husband had been a triathlete who made casual comments about her weight, disguised as health concerns, observations that accumulated like small cuts until the marriage became unsustainable. After the divorce, Deborah threw herself into fitness with something that resembled vengeance. Kilimanjaro had been her first summit in 2016, standing at 19,341 feet above Tanzania. She had felt a validation that no boardroom success had ever provided. The experience convinced her that mountains cared nothing about appearance, only effort. It was a comforting belief that happened to be dangerously incomplete. Her climbing resume consisted of that single high-altitude entry. Kilimanjaro required endurance, but minimal technical skill, a week-long trek where altitude sickness was manageable and descent was always an option. When reputable Everest operators questioned her lack of experience, Deborah interpreted their concerns as discrimination rather than legitimate safety assessments. She eventually found a smaller Nepali operator willing to accept her $85,000 payment with minimal screening. The Sherpas assigned to Deborah were Mingma Dorje, 48 years old, and his nephew Dawa, 26, both from Namche Bazaar. Mingma had summited Everest 14 times across a 22-year guiding career. His face showed the weathering of decades spent at extreme altitude, deep lines around his eyes from squinting against glacier glare, skin darkened and toughened by wind and cold. He supported 3 children whose education consumed most of his guiding income. His oldest daughter was studying engineering in Kathmandu at a university that cost more annually than many Sherpa families earned in 3 years. The tuition payment was due in 3 weeks, and Mingma had exactly enough saved if this expedition paid out as contracted. Walking away from a $6,000 guiding fee, split between the 2 men, would jeopardize everything his family had worked toward. Dawa had completed 4 Everest summits and was engaged to be married in August, the wedding funded entirely by his climbing income. He possessed less diplomatic patience than his uncle, a directness that had occasionally cost him work. Where Mingma had learned to swallow frustrations for the sake of employment, Dawa still believed honesty mattered more than client comfort. Mingma valued his nephew's integrity, even when it created friction, believing that silence in the mountains killed more people than uncomfortable conversations. The problems began during the first camp meeting, when Mingma attempted to review safety protocols with the 12 clients assigned to their expedition company. Deborah sat at the back scrolling through her phone, responding to social media comments on her most recent post about breaking barriers on the world's highest mountain. The post had generated significant engagement, nearly 4,000 likes and hundreds of supportive comments from followers who saw her expedition as a representation that mattered. When Mingma explained the importance of efficient movement through the Khumbu Icefall, the objective hazard zone where speed meant survival and delays could trap climbers beneath unstable seracs during the warmest hours. Deborah looked up briefly and said she understood, then returned to her screen without asking questions. The following morning, Deborah emerged from her tent with a handwritten list of requests. She wanted Mingma and Dawa to carry her camera equipment, a professional DSLR with 2 lenses that added 4 pounds, along with spare clothing layers and portable charging equipment for her social media documentation. When Mingma explained that Sherpas carried group equipment, safety gear, and emergency supplies rather than personal items, Deborah's response came sharp and immediate. She had paid premium rates specifically for premium service, and carrying her gear was part of that service. The expedition leader, Tenzing, sided with Deborah. The additional weight was reasonable. The Sherpas would accommodate it. Mingma accepted the decision without further argument, understanding that the power structure of commercial expeditions did not reward Sherpa objections to client demands. Over the following days, Mingma and Dawa developed a private catalog of grievances, shared only in Nepali. She complained about her tent placement 3 separate times. She criticized the expedition's food. She referred to the Sherpas in her social media posts as my team and my guides, language that reduced them to accessories in her narrative rather than the experienced mountaineers whose judgment would determine whether she lived or died above 26,000 feet. During group discussions, she interrupted Mingma multiple times to ask basic questions that had already been answered in the briefing she had ignored. Dawa expressed his frustration to Mingma during a load carry to Camp 1, speaking quietly as they climbed alone through the icefall in pre-dawn darkness. The client treated them like hotel staff rather than climbing partners, and her physical condition concerned him more than her attitude. She moved slowly, even at base camp, her breathing heavier than it should be during simple tasks. Mingma agreed, but offered no solution beyond patience and observation. The first acclimatization rotation began on April 28th. The climb to Camp 1 required navigating the Khumbu Icefall, a chaotic maze of crevasses, unstable seracs, and aluminum ladders that shifted daily as the glacier ground downslope. The route measured approximately 2,000 vertical feet and typically required 3 to 4 hours for acclimatized climbers. Objective hazards, seracs collapsing without warning, shifting ladders over widening slots, and ice towers shedding blocks as the sun warmed the glacier meant that time in the hazard zone needed to be minimized. Teams departed before dawn, moving through the worst sections while overnight cold kept the ice stiffer and reduced the odds of seracs shifting or collapsing as the sun rose. Deborah required nearly 7 hours to reach Camp 1. By the final ladders, Mingma could feel the day warming under his crampons, and he knew they'd spent far longer in the icefall than any guide would ever want. Her pace through the technical sections was painfully slow, each ladder crossing preceded by long pauses where she tested the rungs repeatedly before committing her weight. The ladders, sometimes 3 or 4 lashed together to span wide crevasses whose bottoms disappeared into blue shadow, flexed and swayed with each step, requiring balance and confidence that Deborah clearly lacked. The rope team behind her waited without complaint initially, but the delays accumulated. By the time they emerged from the icefall's upper section, the sun had risen high enough to warm the ice, and the sharp cracks of shifting seracs echoed across the glacier like distant thunder. Mingma climbed directly behind Deborah throughout the ascent. He watched her crampon technique, noting that her foot placements lacked confidence and her balance seemed uncertain on steep terrain. She crossed her feet while traversing, a beginner mistake that risked snagging and falling. These were fundamental skills that should have been mastered long before attempting Everest. At Camp 1, after she disappeared into her tent without helping with camp tasks, Mingma checked her oxygen saturation using his pulse oximeter. The reading showed 73%, low but not immediately dangerous at 19,500 feet. 73% was concerning but not shocking at that altitude, where even acclimatized climbers often read in the 70s depending on cold, fatigue, and circulation. Still, it suggested her body was struggling to adapt, a warning sign that would become critical at higher camps where margins disappeared. The second rotation to Camp 2 revealed the same pattern. The climb from Camp 1 traversed the western CWM, a vast glacial valley that became became a heat trap during midday when the sun reflected off surrounding ice walls. Temperatures could rise into the 50s despite the 21,000-foot altitude, creating conditions that dehydrated climbers rapidly and accelerated exhaustion. The route stretched for miles across relatively flat terrain, crisscrossed with crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges. Fixed ropes guided the way, but the distance and the furnace heat made the approach to Camp 2 a grinding test of endurance. Sweat soaked through Deborah's base layers, despite the altitude, and she removed her shell jacket within the first hour, stuffing it clumsily into her pack, while other climbers moved past her on the rope line. Deborah struggled badly in the heat. Her pace dropped to 20 steps, followed by extended rest. Her face flushed red beneath her glacier glasses, and her movements increasingly uncoordinated. At one point, she sat down in the snow and did not move for nearly 15 minutes, her head bowed and her chest heaving. When Dawa asked if she could continue, she waved him off without speaking. At Camp 2, she immediately demanded that Mingma and Dawa melt additional water and bring meals to her tent. When Mingma checked her oxygen saturation that evening, it had dropped to 68% at rest, and paired with her exhaustion and coordination issues, it was enough to make him worry about what might happen if she worsened. He explained carefully that continuing upward with declining numbers increased the risk of pulmonary or cerebral edema, swelling in the lungs or brain that could worsen fast without immediate descent. Deborah's response stunned both Sherpas. She accused Mingma of treating her differently because of her body type, of applying standards that wouldn't be raised for thinner climbers. She was being targeted with fat phobia, disguised as a medical concern. Mingma attempted to clarify that oxygen saturation measurements were objective data unrelated to body type, that the device measured blood oxygen levels without regard to weight or appearance. He mentioned that other clients at similar altitudes had tested higher, that the numbers indicated her body specifically was struggling to process oxygen. Deborah had already decided the conversation was discriminatory. She turned away without responding, ending the discussion before it could go further. Deborah contacted Tenzing via radio and complained that her Sherpas were creating a hostile environment. Tenzing's response, delivered during a private conversation with Mingma the following morning, made the power structure clear. Deborah was a paying client who had signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks. Unless she deteriorated into something undeniable, confusion, inability to walk, or obvious respiratory distress, the expedition would continue. The Sherpas needed to maintain professional conduct and avoid conflicts that could damage the company's reputation. Client complaints spread quickly through the tight network of expedition operators, and difficult Sherpas found themselves unemployed regardless of their experience. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel, make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. The third rotation to Camp 3 revealed the full scope of Deborah's inadequacy. The climb from Camp 2 required ascending the Lhotse face, a 2,300 vertical foot wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained leg strength and cardiovascular capacity that altitude steadily depleted. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Deborah took 9 hours and 15 minutes. Dawa stayed with her the entire way, watching her deterioration with growing alarm. She stopped every 30 to 40 feet, her breathing shallow and rapid, her legs trembling visibly between efforts. Twice she nearly lost her footing, catching herself on the fixed rope while her crampons scraped uselessly across hard ice. The trembling in her legs worsened as they climbed higher, the muscle fatigue compounding with oxygen deprivation, until even standing still became an act of will. Around 22,000 feet, she began making small errors that experienced climbers never made, forgetting to unclip her safety before moving to the next anchor, pulling on the rope instead of stepping up with her legs, pausing mid-traverse where the angle demanded constant movement. Dawa watched each mistake accumulate into a pattern he'd seen before, always in climbers who were hours away from complete failure. The mountain was grinding her down cell by cell, and the summit was still 7,500 feet above them. On the fixed lines, even simple transitions, clipping, unclipping, and sliding her ascender, stopped being automatic and started taking effort she didn't have. At one point, roughly 2/3 up the face, she simply stopped and stared at the ice without moving, her eyes unfocused and her expression distant, as if she had forgotten where she was. When they finally reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, Deborah collapsed into her tent and did not emerge for the rest of the evening. Dawa found Mingma and stated clearly that continuing the expedition would kill their client. Her physical condition had crossed from struggling to failing. Her oxygen saturation at Camp 3 measured 64% at rest, a number that, combined with her confusion and coordination problems, put cerebral edema on the table. They needed to descend immediately. Mingma agreed completely, but had no power to enforce it. He radioed Tenzing and delivered the same recommendation. An hour later, Deborah's voice came through the radio, crackling with altitude-thinned air and absolute determination. She felt fine. The climb had been hard, but she had made it. She was continuing to the summit. The Sherpas could either support her decision, or she would file formal complaints about their unprofessional conduct, which would include social media exposure about discrimination and prejudice in Nepali guiding companies. The threat carried weight that technical arguments and medical data could not overcome. A single viral social media post accusing him of discrimination could end Mingma's career permanently. Dawa's wedding required the income this climb provided. Walking away would brand them as difficult Sherpas who abandoned clients. They descended to base camp with Deborah in silence, preparing for the summit push. Neither believed she would survive. The weather window opened on May 18th. Meteorologists predicted a 36-hour period of reduced winds and clear skies. Deborah insisted on joining the push despite having shown no improvement during her rest period. If anything, she appeared thinner and more exhausted than before, her face gaunt and her movements slow. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 required 2 days, with overnight stops at Camp 2. They touched Camp 3 only long enough to reset gear and oxygen before continuing upward. Deborah moved like someone operating on fumes, her pace steady but ominously mechanical. At Camp 4, 26,000 feet into the death zone, Mingma checked her oxygen saturation one final time before the summit push. After warming her hands and taking multiple readings, the best number they could coax from the oximeter was still ugly, 61%, even after they briefly put her on oxygen ahead of schedule and tried to stabilize her breathing. Mingma made his last attempt to stop what he knew was about to happen. He knelt beside Deborah in her tent while the wind battered the fabric. He spoke with careful precision, measuring each word. Her oxygen levels indicated severe hypoxia. Her body was not getting enough oxygen to sustain basic functions. If she continued upward, she would lose consciousness, somewhere above 27,000 feet. At that altitude, rescue was impossible. She would die on the mountain, and there was nothing he or Dawa could do to prevent it. He begged her to descend, while she could still walk under her own power. Deborah's response came without hesitation. She had not spent $85,000 and 18 months training to quit within sight of the summit. If she died trying, at least she would die attempting something meaningful. She ordered them to prepare for departure at 11:30 that night. The summit push began under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. Deborah moved upward with Mingma in front and Dawa behind, the three of them part of a long chain of headlamps ascending toward the southeast ridge. The cold was brutal, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, but Deborah's layers held and her extremities remained functional. For the first 2 hours, she maintained a pace that suggested she might defy the Sherpas' predictions. The rhythm of movement, step, breathe, slide a glove along the fixed line, breathe again, became meditative in the darkness. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, the deterioration accelerated. Deborah's rest stops extended from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, then longer. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, each exhale accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that made Dawa think of climbers whose lungs were starting to fail. She stumbled repeatedly, catching herself on the fixed rope, but showing the impaired coordination that accompanied cerebral hypoxia. Other climbers passed them, moving steadily toward the summit. Some offered words of encouragement, most said nothing, focused entirely on their own survival. At 28,000 feet, with 800 vertical feet remaining to the summit, Deborah asked whether they had already summited. Mingma told her they had not, that the summit was still above them, that they needed to keep moving. She nodded and continued climbing. 10 minutes later, she asked the same question. Dawa moved closer, recognizing the confusion as a symptom of cerebral edema, brain swelling that disrupted cognition and would progress to unconsciousness and death if not reversed by immediate descent. He told Mingma they needed to go down immediately, that waiting longer would make make descent impossible. Before Mingma could respond, Deborah sat down in the snow and refused to move. She repeated that she hadn't come this far to quit, that the summit was close, and she was finishing what she started. When Mingma tried to help her stand, she pushed his hands away with surprising force. When Dawa explained they were out of time, she accused him of sabotaging her expedition. The turnaround time had already passed. Dawn was approaching. They were descending whether she cooperated or not. What followed was a struggle with physics rather than will. Deborah had stopped functioning as a climbing partner and become dead weight that needed to be moved down technical terrain in the death zone. At sea level, 2 fit men could carry 240 pounds between them without excessive difficulty. At 28,200 feet, with steep terrain, technical challenges, and their own bodies failing from hypoxia and exhaustion, it was nearly impossible. They clipped her harness into the fixed line between them and tried to inch her down in short, controlled drops. They tried for nearly 2 hours, lowering her down short sections of fixed rope, supporting her weight when the angle allowed, pleading with her to help by moving her legs and maintaining some semblance of coordination. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes responding to commands, sometimes staring blankly at nothing, sometimes asking whether they had summited yet. Each meter of descent demanded coordination that both men were running out of. Mingma's fingers had gone numb inside his gloves an hour earlier, making every rope adjustment clumsy and uncertain. Dawa's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, his own hypoxia building as he burned through reserves trying to keep Deborah clipped and controlled. Twice her weight shifted unexpectedly and nearly pulled all 3 of them off the fixed line. They kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant leaving families without support and a woman's body as evidence of their failure. Between long pauses, traffic on the fixed line, and repeated failed attempts to get her moving, the struggle dragged on through the morning. At approximately 10:15 a.m. on May 19, 2017, Deborah Mitchell lost consciousness completely and stopped breathing. Mingma checked for a pulse at her neck and found nothing. No steady beat, no rhythm that returned when he waited and checked again. Dawa cleared ice from her mask and checked her airway as best he could through frozen straps, then opened her flow fully and held the mask tight, but nothing brought her back. The altitude had killed her exactly as they had warned, her body finally surrendering to a rapid spiral of hypoxia and edema that only worsened with every step above the balcony. They stayed with her body for 20 minutes before accepting what could not be changed. Recovery at this altitude was impossible. Given the terrain and her weight, Mingma radioed base camp at 10:40 a.m., reporting the death and their position, and was told a full report would be required upon return. Deborah would remain where she died, another body on Everest's upper slopes, passed by climbers who would never know her name or story. The descent to Camp 4 stretched into a brutal stop-and-start crawl that ended late that night, leaving both Sherpas frostbitten and emotionally shattered. The official investigations cited high-altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema, noting the client had been warned repeatedly and chose to continue. Initial online reaction blamed the Sherpas, but the narrative shifted as other clients, radio transcripts, and oxygen logs confirmed her refusals to descend. The criticism faded. Mingma continued guiding, but began refusing unqualified clients, even at personal cost. Dawa left expedition work entirely, opening a small tea house in Namche Bazaar. Deborah's body remains at approximately 28,200 feet, slowly absorbed into the ice, a reminder that Everest does not care why someone climbs. It was May 3rd, 2015, at Camp 2 on Cho Oyu, the world's 6th highest mountain, where the morning air held a crystalline clarity that made the summit appear deceptively close. The camp sat at 21,300 feet on a relatively flat section of glacier, tucked beneath the massive southwest face that rose another 5,500 vertical feet above. Temperatures hovered around -10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that breath froze instantly into ice crystals, but warm enough that climbers moved between tents without full expedition gear. The sky stretched overhead in that particular shade of deep blue that only existed above 20,000 feet, where atmosphere thinned to a fraction of sea level density. Prayer flags strung between camps snapped in the wind, their colors brilliant against the white and gray landscape. Among the dozen expeditions staged at Camp 2 was a private operation that had attracted attention from the moment it arrived at base camp 3 weeks earlier. The clients were Marcus and Jennifer Ashford, ages 51 and 47, from Greenwich, Connecticut. Marcus had built and sold a hedge fund in 2013 for a sum he described to anyone who asked as north of $180 million. The exit had funded what the couple called their transformation, a shift from Wall Street careers to adventure pursuits that demonstrated commitment to experiences over accumulation. They trained with personal trainers 5 days per week, completed 2 marathons, and maintained body fat percentages in the athletic range. Their climbing resume consisted of a guided summit of Mount Rainier 18 months earlier and a trek to Kilimanjaro's summit the previous year. Both experiences had been documented extensively on social media, where Jennifer's account had accumulated nearly 40,000 followers interested in her narrative about redefining success after corporate life. Cho Oyu represented the next chapter in that narrative. The couple had paid $140,000 for a private expedition, nearly triple the cost of joining a standard commercial group. The fee covered exclusive Sherpa support, customized logistics, and the flexibility to operate on their own schedule rather than coordinating with larger teams. Their stated goal was to prove that high-altitude mountaineering was accessible to people who approached it with proper preparation and mental discipline, regardless of technical climbing background. What they lacked was any understanding of how altitude affected human physiology beyond what could be learned in spreadsheets and training logs. The Sherpas assigned to the Ashfords were Phurba Tamang, 37, and his cousin Ngima Lama, 29, both from Namche Bazaar. Phurba had summited Cho Oyu 9 times across 15 years of guiding. His face showed the characteristic weathering of long-term, high-altitude work, deep creases around his eyes from decades of glacier glare, skin darkened and toughened by constant exposure to cold and wind. He supported a family of 5, including a 9-year-old daughter who had been diagnosed with a congenital heart condition requiring surgery in Kathmandu. The procedure was scheduled for July and would cost approximately $8,000, an amount that represented nearly 2 years of typical Sherpa income. Phurba had exactly enough saved if this expedition paid out as contracted, and if he completed 2 additional climbs before the season ended. Ngima had completed 4 Cho Oyu summits and was engaged to be married in September. The wedding, planned for his home village, required funds that exceeded what his family could contribute. His guiding income over the past 2 seasons had built the necessary amount, but the margin was thin. Walking away from a $7,500 payment, split between the 2 men, would force postponement and create complications with his fiancée's family that extended beyond simple financial embarrassment. Before the first acclimatization rotation began, the Ashfords underwent the standard pre-rotation medical screening at Advanced Base Camp. The process was brief and procedural, designed less to exclude clients than to document that basic checks had been performed. A Nepali expedition medic recorded resting heart rates, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation readings, while climbers sat bundled in down jackets outside the medical tent. The numbers were logged, signed, and added to a folder that would rarely be opened again unless something went catastrophically wrong. Marcus's resting oxygen saturation at base camp measured 86%, low but still within a range that expedition medics saw regularly at that altitude, and not low enough to trigger an automatic halt. His heart rate hovered persistently above 90 beats per minute, even after 15 minutes of rest, a sign that his cardiovascular system was already compensating harder than it should have been. Jennifer's numbers were marginally better, but she reported difficulty sleeping, frequent headaches, and a lingering shortness of breath during simple tasks like dressing or walking between tents. None of these findings disqualified them. On paper, they passed. Phurba watched the screening from a distance, recognizing the familiar pattern. Base camp medical checks were designed to catch obvious emergencies, not to predict who would fail. Higher up, they could identify infections, severe illness, or immediate danger, but they could not measure how a client's brain or lungs would respond once oxygen levels dropped further. What mattered more, the slow adaptation of capillaries, the ability to ventilate efficiently, the neurological resilience under hypoxic stress, could not be assessed in a 10-minute exam. Marcus interpreted the results as validation. The medic had not stopped him. No one had used the word dangerous. To Marcus, the absence of prohibition meant approval. He referenced the numbers later when concerns were raised, pointing out that he had been medically cleared and that his training metrics at home were excellent. Jennifer echoed the sentiment, framing the screening as evidence that their preparation had been sufficient and that any discomfort ahead would simply be part of the process. Furba understood the unspoken rule governing private expeditions. Wealthy clients were not screened out unless failure was undeniable. Operators avoided confrontations that could cost future business. And Sherpas learned quickly that raising objections too early branded them as difficult rather than responsible. The paperwork existed to protect companies after accidents, not to prevent them. Once the forms were signed and the payments secured, the mountain was allowed to decide what the vetting process would not. By the time the Ashfords clipped into their harnesses for the first move toward Camp 1, Furba already knew the margin was thin. The numbers had not warned loudly enough. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do: allow the climb to proceed. The problems had begun during the first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,200 feet. The climb required ascending approximately 1,900 vertical feet from advanced base camp over moderate terrain, steep enough to require front pointing with crampons in sections, but straightforward for anyone with basic mountaineering skills. Strong climbers completed the ascent in 3 to 4 hours. Jennifer required 8 hours and 20 minutes. Her pace dropped to 15 steps, followed by extended rest periods, her breathing rapid and shallow even during pauses. Furba stayed with her the entire way, watching her coordination deteriorate as altitude stress accumulated. She stumbled repeatedly on terrain that should not have challenged anyone wearing crampons properly. Her movements became increasingly uncoordinated, each step requiring visible concentration. Marcus's oxygen saturation at Camp 1 measured 66% at rest, a number that alarmed Furba immediately. At that altitude, even poorly acclimatized climbers typically maintained readings in the low 70s. 66% indicated Marcus's body was failing to process oxygen efficiently, a warning sign that continuing upward would push him into dangerous hypoxia. When Furba explained this and recommended descending for additional acclimatization days before attempting higher camps, Marcus responded that the numbers were being interpreted through outdated protocols. He had researched altitude physiology extensively during his training and believed individual variation meant strict thresholds were unnecessarily conservative. His body felt strong. He was continuing upward. The couple spent 2 nights at Camp 1, then insisted on moving to Camp 2, despite Furba's recommendation for additional rest. The climb required ascending another 2,100 vertical feet over terrain that became progressively steeper and more exposed. Jennifer's pace remained dangerously slow, requiring nearly 7 hours for an ascent that should have taken 4. At Camp 2, both clients immediately disappeared into their tent and did not emerge until the following afternoon. When they did appear, they presented Furba with a list of modifications they wanted implemented: a larger tent with more interior space, specific meal preparations that differed from standard expedition food, and additional rest days built into the schedule before attempting higher camps. The critical incident occurred on their 3rd night at Camp 2. Jennifer removed the oxygen mask Furba had insisted she use intermittently during the night because the straps irritated her face and the hissing sound prevented rest. Supplemental oxygen at that altitude was not standard practice. Most climbers relied on acclimatization rather than bottled gas below Camp 3, but Jennifer's poor adaptation had pushed Furba to treat it as an emergency tool rather than a comfort. Without the brief intervals, her oxygen saturation dropped through the night as her body struggled to process the thin air. The following morning, she emerged from the tent exhibiting clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema in its early stages. Her movements were uncoordinated, her balance uncertain. She stumbled while walking on flat ground between tents. Her speech was slightly slurred, words coming slowly and with visible effort. When Furba asked her to perform a simple heel-to-toe walk test, a standard field assessment for ataxia, she could not maintain balance for more than 3 steps. Combined with her slurred speech and the glassy, unfocused way she tracked movement around her, the failure removed any doubt. These symptoms, paired with her persistent headache and nausea, indicated that fluid was accumulating in her brain tissue. The condition would worsen rapidly if she remained at altitude. Descent was the only effective treatment. Furba explained this carefully, laying out the medical progression and the consequences of continuing upward. Jennifer's response came sharp and immediate. She felt fine aside from expected altitude discomfort. The Sherpas were applying standards inconsistently, treating her differently because she did not fit the typical climber profile. She had not paid $140,000 to be told she could not summit by guides whose job was to help her reach her goal. Marcus supported her position completely, adding that they had signed comprehensive liability waivers specifically to maintain decision-making authority over their own climb. The expedition's western leader, a British guide named Simon, who had been hired primarily to manage logistics and provide legitimacy to the operation, deferred to the clients. His contract specified that he served in an advisory capacity, and the Ashfords retained final authority over all decisions. When Furba pressed the issue privately, Simon acknowledged the concerns, but noted that attempting to force clients down against their will created its own complications. They were adults who had accepted responsibility for the risks. Unless Jennifer became unable to walk or communicate, the decision remained hers. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. The second acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 at 23,600 feet revealed the full scope of their inadequacy. The route climbed 2,300 vertical feet up increasingly steep terrain, where fixed ropes provided security but could not compensate for poor technique or failing physiology. Marcus fell twice on moderate ground, losing his balance and catching himself on the fixed line before the falls became serious. Both incidents occurred on terrain that should not have challenged anyone with basic crampon skills. Furba recognized the falls as symptoms of deteriorating coordination, early signs that Marcus's brain was not receiving adequate oxygen to maintain fine motor control. Jennifer's persistent cough worsened into something more concerning. The sound was wet and rattling, each exhale producing a gurgling quality that indicated fluid accumulation in her lungs. At Camp 3, Furba listened to her breathing with a stethoscope from his medical kit and heard crackles in the lower lung fields. The characteristic sound of high-altitude pulmonary edema developing. Combined with her elevated heart rate, her breathing difficulty even at rest, and the pink-tinged sputum she tried to conceal, the diagnosis was clear. Her lungs were filling with fluid as capillaries leaked under the stress of extreme altitude. Like cerebral edema, the condition was immediately life-threatening and would worsen rapidly without descent. That evening, Furba and Ngima discussed abandoning the expedition. They sat outside their tent after the clients had retired, speaking quietly in Nepali. Ngima stated plainly that continuing would result in the deaths of one or both clients. The warning signs had progressed beyond concerning to critical. They were no longer guiding a climb. They were supervising a double suicide. Furba agreed completely, but saw no path forward that did not destroy them financially and professionally. Walking away would forfeit their payment immediately. The contract specified that Sherpas who refused to continue for reasons other than objective hazards, avalanche danger, storm conditions, equipment failure, would receive no compensation for work completed beyond the immediate financial loss. Abandoning wealthy Western clients created reputational damage that spread quickly through the tight network of expedition operators. Sherpas who were labeled as difficult or unwilling to accommodate client preferences found themselves unemployed regardless of their experience or safety record. The industry operated on referrals and relationships, and clients like the Ashfords had the resources and connections to ensure their version of events dominated any narrative. The Ashfords themselves created additional pressure through their behavior toward the Sherpas. They demanded that Furba and Ngima carry personal items that exceeded standard loads, camera equipment, extra clothing layers, comfort items that served no safety function. They referred to the Sherpas as our team in social media posts, language that reduced experienced mountaineers to support staff. They interrupted safety briefings, ignored recommendations about pacing and hydration, and treated medical concerns as obstacles to be dismissed rather than warnings to be heeded. The pattern revealed how they understood their relationship to the people whose labor and expertise made their climb possible. On May 18th, the weather forecast showed a stable high-pressure system arriving within 36 hours. Wind speeds above 24,000 feet would drop to 15 miles per hour, temperatures would moderate slightly, and visibility would remain excellent. The conditions represented a legitimate summit window. Expedition teams across Cho Oyu began finalizing their pushes. The Ashfords insisted on attempting the summit despite unanimous recommendations from Furba, Ngima, and Simon that they abort the climb entirely. Their acclimatization had been inadequate. Their physical condition had deteriorated rather than improved. and the symptoms both had exhibited indicated their bodies were failing under altitude stress. Marcus responded that they had traveled too far and invested too much to turn back based on excessive caution. Jennifer added that plenty of climbers felt terrible at altitude and still summited successfully. They were continuing, with or without Sherpa support. The economic reality left Furba and Nyima with no viable options but to refuse. Furba's daughter's surgery was scheduled in 7 weeks, and Nyima's wedding was planned for September. Both men had families whose financial security depended on the income that high-altitude guiding provided. They prepared equipment for the summit push, knowing they were facilitating something that would likely end in death. The departure from Camp 3 occurred at 11:30 p.m. on May 18th, under a sky dense with stars. The temperature had dropped to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin froze in seconds, but manageable with proper layering. The route climbed directly up the upper slopes of Cho Oyu's southwest face, 3,200 vertical feet of sustained effort at altitudes where the oxygen saturation dropped below levels that could sustain consciousness without supplemental gas. Marcus required physical assistance within the first hour. His pace had slowed to a crawl, 10 steps followed by minutes of rest, his breathing rapid and shallow, even while stationary. Furba positioned himself directly behind Marcus, one hand on his harness, effectively supporting a portion of his weight, while Marcus front-pointed up the steep sections. The arrangement meant Furba was climbing for 2 people at an altitude where his own body was struggling to maintain basic function. Jennifer's oxygen supply became a critical issue at 24,500 feet. She had maxed out her flow rate, 4 liters per minute, double the standard setting, and was burning through her bottles far faster than planned. At that rate, her oxygen would be exhausted before reaching the summit, and she would face the descent without supplemental gas at altitudes where bottled oxygen often meant the difference between walking down and dying. When Nyima explained this and recommended turning back immediately, Jennifer responded that she would manage without it if necessary. She had not come this far to quit. The turnaround time of 2 a.m. passed without the clients acknowledging it. Turnaround times existed as hard limits, specifically because summit fever, the overwhelming desire to reach the top regardless of consequences, impaired judgment more reliably than altitude itself. Climbers who violated turnaround times died at predictable rates, either on the descent when exhaustion and darkness combined, or during the night when they could not reach lower camps before their bodies failed. Furba stated clearly that they needed to descend. Marcus and Jennifer continued climbing. By 25,000 feet, both Sherpas recognized they were no longer guiding a climb. They were babysitting clients who had entered the active process of dying, moving upward through the final hours before their bodies shut down completely. Marcus's coordination had deteriorated to the point where Furba was half carrying him, supporting his weight during each step while Marcus's legs trembled with exhaustion. Jennifer's breathing had become labored and wet, each exhale producing sounds that indicated her lungs were filling rapidly with fluid. Her oxygen supply showed red, nearly empty, and she had more than 1,800 vertical feet remaining to the summit with no reserve for the descent. Jennifer collapsed at 26,100 feet, approximately 800 vertical feet below the summit. She sat down in the snow, her movements slow and uncoordinated, and did not respond when Nyima tried to get her moving again. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow and irregular. Within minutes, she slumped sideways and lost consciousness completely. Nyima checked for a pulse at her neck and found it rapid and weak, her heart racing to compensate for oxygen deprivation, even as her blood pressure dropped, and her core systems began shutting down. He tried to rouse her, speaking directly into her ear, shaking her shoulder, attempting anything that might bring her back to awareness. She did not respond. Marcus continued upward alone, either unaware or unwilling to stop for his wife's collapse. Furba stayed with Jennifer while Nyima followed Marcus, unwilling to let him climb completely unsupported into terrain where a single mistake meant death. Marcus reached 26,400 feet before he sat down in the snow and refused to move. His face was pale beneath his oxygen mask, his movements slow and mechanical. When Nyima reached him and explained they needed to descend immediately, Marcus stared at him without comprehension. His eyes were glassy, his expression distant. He had entered the final stage of cerebral hypoxia, the point where cognition collapsed and survival instinct failed. Nyima tried to help Marcus stand, pulling on his harness, supporting his weight, attempting to get his legs moving. Marcus pushed him away with surprising strength, then became limp and unresponsive. Ngima checked his pulse and found it erratic, beating fast, then slow, the rhythm inconsistent as Marcus's heart struggled to function without adequate oxygen. He repositioned Marcus's oxygen mask, opened the flow fully, and tried to stimulate breathing by clearing ice from the valve and keeping Marcus upright against the slope. But the altitude made every movement slow and punishing, and Marcus's condition continued deteriorating. Below, Jennifer had stopped breathing entirely. Furba confirmed the absence of pulse, the absence of chest movement, and the complete stillness that indicated death. Her body remained where it had fallen, her face peaceful beneath the oxygen mask, the mountain having taken her exactly as Furba had warned weeks earlier at Camp 2. Marcus died at 26,300 feet during Ngima's attempts to drag him downward. His pulse stopped, his breathing ceased, and nothing Ngima could do at that altitude could restart systems that had failed completely. Ngima remained with the body for nearly 20 minutes before accepting what could not be changed. Two bodies at 26,000 feet in the death zone could not be recovered by two exhausted Sherpas operating at the limits of their own survival. Descent was the only option. Furba and Ngima reached Camp 3 by mid-morning on May 19th and reported the deaths to base camp by radio, providing coordinates and a brief account of what had happened. A recovery attempt was organized days later, but the bodies were deemed unrecoverable due to altitude and terrain. Marcus and Jennifer Ashford remain on Cho Oyu's upper slopes, among the bodies marking the mountain's death zone. The investigation later concluded the deaths were caused by high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, inadequate acclimatization, and repeated refusals to descend. Legal action threatened by the Ashford family was dismissed after records confirmed the warnings given. Furba continued guiding, but stopped accepting private clients. Ngima left high-altitude climbing entirely, later opening a lower-altitude trekking company in the Khumbu Valley. It was October 14th, 2016, at 2:30 a.m. on the northwest ridge of one of the world's 14 highest peaks. At 26,906 feet above sea level, the mountain's summit approach stretched across an exposed ridge where winds regularly exceeded hurricane force and temperatures plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The pre-dawn darkness concealed the treacherous terrain ahead, revealing only what expedition headlamps could illuminate across the endless white slopes. Above 26,000 feet, atmospheric pressure dropped to 1/3 of sea level, creating conditions that pushed equipment and human endurance to their absolute limits. Marlene Patterson was 67 years old, a retired librarian from Phoenix, Arizona, who had spent her career organizing information with methodical precision and helping students navigate complex research projects. Known among her hiking group for her careful planning and steady pace on weekend excursions through the desert canyons of the Southwest, she had maintained an active outdoor lifestyle well into her 60s, completing challenging multi-day backpacking trips across Arizona's most demanding terrain. After her husband Robert's death from pancreatic cancer 3 years earlier, Marlene had channeled her grief into an ambitious goal that surprised everyone who knew her, summiting one of the world's 14 peaks above 8,000 meters. She had approached this challenge with the same systematic methodology she had applied to her professional life, spending months researching training programs, hiring experienced coaches, and building her high-altitude resume through progressively more challenging climbs. Her mountaineering background had begun modestly with local rock climbing courses at an indoor gym, where she learned basic rope work and belaying techniques before progressing to outdoor climbing on Arizona's sandstone formations. Over 2 years, she had systematically built her technical skills, completing multi-pitch routes in places like Camelback Mountain and the Superstition Wilderness, always under the guidance of certified instructors who praised her attention to safety protocols and equipment management. Her transition to high-altitude climbing began with the successful ascent of Mount Whitney in California, followed by Mount Rainier in Washington, where she first experienced the challenges of glacier travel and altitude above 14,000 feet. These preparatory climbs had taught her the fundamentals of crampon use, self-arrest techniques, and the physical demands of carrying heavy packs at altitude, providing her with the technical foundation necessary for attempting one of the world's most challenging peaks. Her preparation had been thorough and deliberate. She had already completed successful ascents of Denali in Alaska and Aconcagua in Argentina, building her high-altitude experience systematically over 2 climbing seasons. These expeditions had taught her the basics of high-altitude physiology, cold weather survival, and technical climbing skills required for major peaks. However, her experience above 20,000 feet remained limited to those 2 climbs, and neither had exposed her to the extreme conditions found above 26,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure drops to 1/3 of sea level and the human body struggles to maintain normal function. For this expedition, she had hired Mountain Ascent International, a reputable commercial guiding company with a strong safety record that specialized in oxygen-assisted climbs via the standard Northwest Ridge route. The company's approach emphasized careful acclimatization, conservative weather windows, and experienced guide-to-client ratios that had resulted in a 78% summit success rate over the previous 5 years. The mountain summit ridge, at 26,000 feet, represented one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The exposed terrain offered no shelter from winds that regularly exceeded 40 miles per hour, creating wind chill factors that dropped effective temperatures to -60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. At this altitude, atmospheric pressure contained only 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level, forcing climbers to take 3 to 4 breaths for every step forward, while their hearts raced at 120 to 140 beats per minute just to maintain basic circulation. The physiological effects were severe and predictable. Blood oxygen saturation levels dropped to 35 to 40%. Cognitive function became severely impaired as the brain struggled with oxygen deprivation, and the risk of high-altitude cerebral edema increased exponentially with every hour spent above 26,000 feet. Weather forecasts had indicated a narrow 18-hour window of clear conditions before the arrival of a major storm system that would bring winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and heavy snowfall that could dump 3 feet of snow in 6 hours. The expedition's lead guide, Daniel Patel, a veteran of 12 successful summits on this peak over 8 years, had emphasized the critical nature of this weather window during the pre-climb briefing at base camp. Posted warnings at base camp detailed the specific risks of attempting summit pushes outside predicted weather windows, noting that rescue operations above 26,000 feet were impossible during storm conditions, and that climbers caught in severe weather at high altitude faced near certain death from exposure. Local climbing authorities had issued advisories about the approaching weather system, recommending that all teams either commit to summit attempts within the narrow window or wait for the next favorable period, which weather models predicted would not occur for at least 10 days due to the onset of winter weather patterns. During the acclimatization period at base camp, located at 17,600 feet, the lead guide had noted Marlene's slower than average adaptation to altitude compared to the other 5 team members. While most climbers showed normal acclimatization patterns with mild headaches and fatigue that improved over several days, Marlene experienced persistent headaches that required regular doses of ibuprofen and showed signs of sleep disruption that indicated her body was struggling more than usual with the altitude adjustment. Her appetite decreased significantly, and she required additional rest days between rotations to higher camps, extending her acclimatization schedule by 3 days beyond the standard protocol. Despite these warning signs, her vital signs remained within acceptable ranges, and she demonstrated good technical climbing skills during practice sessions on the lower sections of the route. Dawa Lama, the expedition's senior climbing support, had worked on this mountain for 15 years and could read altitude sickness signs before Western guides noticed them. On the second day at base camp, he quietly mentioned to Daniel Patel that Marlene's breathing pattern during rest periods reminded him of other older clients who had developed serious problems. Sherpas called it mountain fever brain, and when climbers lost the ability to make good decisions about their own safety. Dawa had seen it before in determined clients who pushed beyond their limits. At the intermediate camp, positioned at 23,000 feet, support staff observed more concerning signs of altitude-related impairment that suggested Marlene was approaching her physiological limits. She required assistance with basic crampon adjustments, a fundamental skill she had practiced extensively during her training climbs and had performed flawlessly at lower altitudes. More troubling, she demonstrated confusion about rope management systems that she had used successfully on previous expeditions, asking repeated questions about procedures she had mastered months earlier. Her coordination appeared subtly impaired as she struggled with tasks that should have been automatic after months of training, and her speech occasionally became slightly slurred during conversations, particularly in the evening hours when fatigue accumulated. During the evening briefing at 23,000 feet, Daniel Patel reviewed each team member's readiness with his assistant guide. Marlene's name came up repeatedly as they discussed contingency plans. Her slower acclimatization rate and increasing confusion about basic procedures had them implementing unofficial buddy protocols where support staff would stay closer to her during technical sections. The guides agreed on specific warning signs that would trigger an immediate descent, regardless of her protests. When questioned about her condition by the guide team, Marlene insisted she felt strong and was simply being cautious with her equipment checks, displaying the subtle denial and impaired judgment that often accompany early-stage altitude sickness. She became defensive when guides suggested additional rest days, arguing that she had trained too hard and come too far to delay her summit attempt for minor discomfort. Her determination was admirable, but experienced guides recognized the pattern of behavior that indicated her brain was not receiving adequate oxygen to maintain normal cognitive function. The guide team held private discussions about whether to recommend that Marlene descend to base camp for additional acclimatization, but her vital signs remained stable, and she continued to demonstrate adequate technical climbing ability during daylight hours. Other expedition members began noticing Marlene's struggles during mealtimes, when she would stare at her food for long periods, or forget mid-conversation what she had been discussing. Zara Okafor, a software engineer from Seattle on her third major peak, later recalled feeling uncomfortable watching Marlene fumble with gear that should have been routine. The team's unspoken concern grew as they watched her take twice as long to complete simple tasks that other climbers managed automatically. The evening before the summit push, support staff noted additional warning signs that suggested early-stage cerebral edema was beginning to affect Marlene's neurological function. She appeared disoriented during the equipment check, repeatedly asking questions about procedures she had reviewed multiple times and seeming confused about the sequence of preparations that had become routine over the previous weeks. Her coordination seemed impaired as she struggled with tasks like adjusting her oxygen regulator and organizing her summit pack, movements that required fine motor control and had become second nature during her training. Most concerning, she demonstrated difficulty following multi-step instructions, requiring guides to break down simple procedures into individual components and repeat directions multiple times. Despite gentle suggestions from the guide team that she considered descending to allow more time for acclimatization, Marlene firmly refused, stating that this climb represented a promise she had made to her late husband's memory and that she would not abandon the attempt unless physically unable to continue. She became emotional when discussing the possibility of retreat, explaining that Robert had always supported her outdoor adventures and that completing this climb would honor his belief in her capabilities. The guides respected her determination, but documented their concerns in the expedition log and established specific criteria for mandatory retreat if her condition deteriorated further during the summit push. At 2:30 a.m. on October 14th, the summit team departed from high camp in clear conditions, with temperatures at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and winds gusting to 45 miles per hour. The route followed a well-established path along the northwest ridge, marked by fixed ropes anchored to the mountain at regular intervals and maintained by previous expeditions throughout the climbing season. Marlene moved slowly but steadily during the initial hours of the climb, maintaining her position in the middle of the six-person team and following the established rhythm of rest steps and breathing patterns that conserved energy at extreme altitude. Her supplemental oxygen system functioned properly, delivering 2 liters per minute flow rate of pure oxygen through a mask system that had been tested and adjusted multiple times during the acclimatization period. However, by 4 a.m., as the team reached 26,400 feet on the exposed summit ridge, her pace had slowed significantly beyond the normal reduction expected at extreme altitude. She required frequent rest stops that lasted longer than the brief pauses typical for high-altitude climbing, and her breathing became increasingly labored, despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through her mask. The guides noticed that her coordination was deteriorating as she struggled with basic movements like clipping and unclipping from fixed ropes, procedures that should have been automatic after weeks of practice. Her speech became slurred when she attempted to communicate with team members, and she began making minor errors in judgment about route finding and equipment management that indicated cognitive impairment. At 4:15 a.m., while attempting to clip her safety line into a fixed rope anchor point, Marlene suddenly collapsed onto the snow-covered ridge, falling forward onto her hands and knees and remaining motionless for several seconds before responding to calls from the guide team. The lead guide immediately recognized the symptoms of severe altitude sickness. Her lips had turned blue despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through her mask. Her breathing had become labored and irregular, with a respiratory rate exceeding 30 breaths per minute, and she appeared disoriented and confused about her location, asking repeatedly where she was and how long they had been climbing. After checking her oxygen flow rate and mask seal, the guide determined that her equipment was functioning properly, indicating that her condition resulted from physiological altitude effects rather than equipment failure. Marlene remained conscious but insisted she could continue after a 10-minute rest period, displaying the impaired judgment characteristic of cerebral edema, where swelling brain tissue affects decision-making capabilities and self-awareness. She argued with the guides about her condition, claiming that she simply needed to catch her breath and adjust her pace, despite obvious signs that her body was failing to adapt to the extreme altitude. The guide team made the immediate decision to begin descent, recognizing that her symptoms would only worsen with continued exposure to the death zone environment. However, Marlene became combative and argumentative, refusing to accept that her summit attempt was over and attempting to continue climbing despite direct orders from the lead guide. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding these stories compelling, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more detailed analyses of climbing accidents and survival situations. This behavioral change represented a classic symptom of high-altitude cerebral edema, where swelling brain tissue affects personality and decision-making capabilities, often causing climbers to make irrational decisions that endanger themselves and their team members. As the team prepared for descent, Marlene's coordination continued to deteriorate rapidly, and she began stumbling over her own feet while walking on relatively flat terrain. The guides implemented emergency descent protocols, with 2 team members assigned to assist Marlene directly, while the others managed rope systems and route finding down the technical sections of the ridge. During the attempted descent from the 26,400-foot position, Marlene lost her footing while navigating a steep snow section of the ridge that required careful crampon placement and balance. Despite being clipped into the fixed rope system that should have prevented a serious fall, she stumbled backward and fell approximately 15 feet down a steep slope before the rope arrested her fall with a violent jerk that sent shockwaves through her body. The impact occurred on a section where exposed rocks protruded through the snow cover, and Marlene landed heavily on her left side with her full body weight plus the weight of her summit pack concentrated on her left leg. The force of the impact, combined with the awkward angle of her fall while wearing heavy mountaineering boots and crampons that caught on the rock surface, caused a compound fracture of her left femur approximately 6 inches above the knee. The broken bone protruded through her insulated climbing suit, creating an open wound that immediately began bleeding onto the snow, creating a stark red stain that spread rapidly across the white surface. The sound of the bone breaking was audible to team members positioned nearby, a sharp crack that cut through the wind noise and immediately indicated the severity of the injury. At 26,400 feet, with storm conditions approaching and no possibility of helicopter evacuation, due to the extreme altitude and weather conditions, the compound fracture represented a death sentence that everyone on the team understood immediately. The support team immediately attempted to stabilize Marlene's condition, applying pressure to control bleeding, using sterile gauze from the expedition medical kit, and attempting to immobilize the fractured leg using available climbing equipment, including ice axes and rope, to create a makeshift splint. However, the combination of severe blood loss, shock from the traumatic injury, and the physiological stress of extreme altitude created a cascade of medical complications that could not be addressed with the limited medical supplies available to the climbing team. The expedition's medical supplies, while comprehensive for typical high-altitude emergencies, were designed for stabilization and evacuation scenarios that assumed rescue was possible within hours. The medical kit contained morphine for pain management, sterile bandages for wound care, and basic splinting materials, but nothing that could address the catastrophic blood loss and shock that resulted from major trauma at extreme altitude. Even the most experienced expedition medics understood that their role above 26,000 feet was limited to comfort care when serious injuries occurred, as the combination of altitude and weather made advanced medical intervention impossible. Within minutes of the fall, Marlene went into hypovolemic shock as blood loss from the compound fracture lowered her blood pressure to critical levels, causing her pulse to become rapid and weak, while her skin turned pale and cold to the touch. The extreme cold accelerated the onset of hypothermia as her immobilized condition prevented her body from generating heat through movement, and her core temperature began dropping rapidly. Despite the insulated clothing and emergency bivouac shelter that team members erected around her position, her supplemental oxygen system continued to function, but her body's ability to utilize the available oxygen decreased rapidly as shock and hypothermia compromised her cardiovascular system's ability to circulate blood effectively to vital organs. 2 support staff members remained with Marlene, while the lead guide coordinated with base camp via radio to report the emergency situation and request guidance on evacuation procedures. Though everyone involved understood that no rescue was possible at their current altitude and weather conditions, base camp operations confirmed that no helicopter could operate above 20,000 feet in current conditions, and that the approaching storm system would make any ground-based rescue attempt impossible for several days. The team's medical officer, a paramedic with extensive wilderness medicine training, administered pain medication and continued efforts to stabilize Marlene's condition. But the combination of altitude, trauma, and environmental factors had created a situation beyond the scope of field treatment capabilities. The guides had trained for medical emergencies, but the reality of making life and death decisions while managing their own altitude-induced cognitive impairment created an emotional burden that would affect the entire team long after they returned to base camp. At 4:47 a.m., Marlene lost consciousness as her blood pressure dropped below the level necessary to maintain brain function, her eyes rolling back and her body becoming limp despite continued efforts by team members to keep her responsive. The support team continued CPR attempts and maintained her supplemental oxygen flow, but her pulse became increasingly weak and irregular, dropping to barely detectable levels as her cardiovascular system struggled to maintain circulation in the extreme conditions. The combination of altitude, blood loss, and hypothermia had created conditions that would have challenged even a fully equipped hospital emergency room, let alone a climbing team operating with basic medical supplies at the edge of survivable altitude. At 5:23 a.m., witnessed by the 2 support staff members who had remained with her throughout the emergency, Marlene stopped breathing and showed no detectable pulse despite continued CPR efforts. The team continued resuscitation attempts for an additional 10 minutes, but the extreme conditions and her traumatic injuries had created a situation where survival was impossible. The lead guide made the difficult decision to cease resuscitation efforts and focus on the safety of the surviving team members, who were also at risk from the approaching storm and the extended exposure to death zone conditions. The lead guide radioed base camp at 5:30 a.m. to report the fatality and request guidance on body recovery procedures. Base camp operations confirmed that the approaching storm front was arriving ahead of schedule, with wind speeds already increasing beyond safe climbing conditions, and that any recovery attempt would need to wait until weather conditions improved. The decision was made to mark Marlene's location with GPS coordinates and retreat to lower altitude before conditions became life-threatening for the surviving team members. The storm system arrived 6 hours later as meteorologists had predicted, bringing sustained winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and heavy snowfall that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet, confirming that no rescue operation could have been attempted even if Marlene had survived her injuries. On October 18th, after weather conditions improved sufficiently to allow safe movement on the upper mountain, a recovery team consisting of experienced high-altitude climbers located Marlene's body using the GPS coordinates recorded during the emergency. The coroner's examination determined that the primary cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors including compound fracture of the left femur, hypovolemic shock, and severe hypothermia. Blood samples showed oxygen saturation levels consistent with severe altitude sickness, confirming that Marlene had been suffering from significant physiological impairment before the fall that caused her fatal injuries. Marlene's remains were quietly repatriated to Phoenix, where her daughter Rebecca made arrangements for cremation according to her mother's wishes. The family held no public service, choosing instead to scatter her ashes at a favorite hiking spot in the Superstition Mountains, where Marlene had trained for her expeditions. Her climbing gear was donated to a local mountaineering club, and her detailed training journals were kept by her daughter as a record of her mother's methodical approach to pursuing her dreams, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It was May 17, 2016, at Everest Base Camp. Snow had been falling intermittently for 3 days, coating the tent village in a fresh layer of white that muffled sound and shortened visibility to a few hundred feet. Overnight, temperatures dropped into the teens, cold enough to freeze water bottles solid, while daylight warmed the camp just enough that climbers moved between tents without full layering. The season was entering its critical window. Weather forecasts suggested a summit opportunity would open within the week, and expedition teams were finalizing their rotation schedules and oxygen allocations. Among the climbers preparing for the push was Walter Brennan, a 68-year-old retired orthopedic surgeon from Boulder, Colorado. He sat in the dining tent of his expedition company, studying a laminated map of the Lhotse face while nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, traced the route with the familiarity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading topographic lines. The other climbers in the tent were decades younger, most in their 30s and 40s, and they deferred to Walter with a respect that bordered on reverence. He was the eldest member of the expedition by nearly 20 years, and his resume demanded acknowledgement. Walter had begun climbing in 1966 at age 18 on the granite walls of El Dorado Canyon outside Boulder. By his mid-20s, he had established first ascents in the Tetons and completed technical routes in the Canadian Rockies that remained test pieces decades later. His medical career had taken him away from serious mountaineering during his 30s and 40s, but he had returned to the high peaks after his children left for college, systematically working through objectives he had dreamed about during long shifts in the operating room. Denali in 2003, Aconcagua in 2007, Cho Oyu in 2011, Manaslu in 2014. Each summit had required months of preparation and careful acclimatization, and each had reinforced his belief that age was a number, not a limitation. Everest was the last entry on a list he'd carried for decades. Every other mountain had been crossed off. Only Everest remained. His wife Eleanor had died of pancreatic cancer 14 months earlier. In the months that followed, Walter trained with an intensity that unsettled his adult children, part grief, part purpose. Eleanor had always believed he would stand on Everest one day. Finishing the climb without her felt like the only way to carry her with him. The expedition company accepted his application with minimal hesitation. On paper, Walter was experienced, fit, and fully paid. Their screening process measured credentials and capability, not the quiet deterioration of age or the psychological weight of climbing through grief. The lead Sherpa assigned to Walter's team was Mingma Dorje, 34 years old, with 11 Everest summits and a reputation for quiet competence. He had guided clients of varying abilities for 8 seasons, developing an intuitive sense for which climbers possessed the reserves necessary for the summit and which were operating on borrowed time. He rarely voiced these assessments directly. The expedition companies did not pay for opinions. They paid for logistics, rope fixing, load carrying, and the steady presence that kept clients moving upward. Judgments about client capability were made silently and acted upon only when circumstances forced the issue. Mingma first observed Walter on the trek from Lukla. Steady pace, controlled breathing, the calm efficiency of someone comfortable in the mountains. But the recovery was slower than it should have been. After steep sections, Walter needed longer pauses than he wanted to admit, and his appetite thinned early. These observations accumulated without being shared. Mingma mentioned nothing to the expedition leader or the other Sherpas, though he suspected they were making similar calculations. The system did not reward early warnings about paying clients. The concerns stayed internal, filed away until circumstances forced the issue. The acclimatization rotations began on May 5th, Camp 1 and back, then Camp 2 overnight, followed by a brief touch of Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, before returning to base camp to rest. Walter completed the first rotation without incident. He moved more slowly than the younger climbers, but his pace was consistent, and his condition upon return was acceptable. He ate dinner, slept 8 hours, and reported feeling strong the following morning. The expedition medic, a Nepali doctor contracted by the company, checked his oxygen saturation and found it within normal ranges for the altitude. There was no medical basis for concern. The second rotation revealed the first cracks. The climb to Camp 2 required crossing the Khumbu icefall in pre-dawn darkness, navigating the labyrinth of crevasses and unstable seracs, an objective hazard that has claimed plenty of lives over the decades. Walter's pace through the icefall was significantly slower than during the approach, his movements deliberate to the point of hesitation. At ladder crossings, he paused longer than other climbers, testing each step before committing his weight. The climbers behind him waited without complaint, but the delays were noted. Mingma climbed directly behind Walter through the icefall, close enough to assist if needed. He watched the older man's crampon placement, the way his legs trembled slightly on the steeper sections, the increasing frequency of his rest stops. At the top of the icefall, where the route flattened into the western CWM, Walter sat down heavily on his pack and did not move for nearly 10 minutes. His face was gray beneath his glacier glasses, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that took too long to normalize. Mingma offered water. Walter accepted it with a shaking hand and drank slowly. When he spoke, his voice was thin, stripped of the confident timbre it had carried at base camp. He mentioned that the altitude was taking its toll, that rest at Camp 2 would help. Mingma nodded without agreeing. He had heard similar reassurances from clients who never reached the summit and from clients who never came down. At Camp 2 that evening, Walter ate half a bowl of soup and disappeared into his tent. His absence was noted, but not questioned. At altitude, even warning signs often pass as routine. Mingma spoke quietly with Pasang Nuru, another experienced Sherpa assigned to the expedition, while the clients talked among themselves. The conversation was brief and conducted in Nepali, away from ears that might misunderstand. Mingma expressed his observation that the older American was deteriorating faster than expected. Pasang agreed. He had noticed the same patterns during the day's climb, the same warning signs that experience had taught them to recognize. They discussed what might happen if the deterioration continued. They did not discuss intervening. The decision to climb or descend belonged to the client, and ultimately, to the expedition leader. The Sherpas would do what they were paid to do. The third rotation was scheduled for May 12th. Walter rested at base camp for 4 days before the push, spending most of his time in his tent, reading and sleeping, and forcing himself to eat meals he did not want. He emerged for the climb, looking thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier, his cheekbones more prominent, the skin beneath his eyes darker and more hollow. The other climbers offered encouragement. Ian Whitfield reviewed the plan and confirmed that conditions looked favorable. No one suggested that Walter should reconsider. The ascent to Camp 3 required climbing the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that rose roughly 2,300 vertical feet above Camp 2 at angles that often hovered around 40 degrees and steepened in sections. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained effort. Each step kicked into firm snow or ice, each pull on the rope drawing from reserves that altitude was steadily depleting. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Walter took nearly 8. Mingma stayed with him the entire way. He watched Walter stop every 50 feet to catch his breath, watched his crampon kicks grow weaker as the hours passed, watched the determination in his eyes harden into something that looked less like resolve and more like desperation. At one point, roughly 2/3 up the face, Walter's legs buckled without warning. He caught himself on the fixed rope, his jumar locking against the downward force. But for a moment, he simply hung there, his body refusing to respond to commands his mind was still issuing. Mingma moved to his side and steadied him by the shoulder. He offered the option to descend, carefully and without judgment. Walter refused immediately. His jaw stayed clenched, his eyes fixed upslope, and his focus narrowed into something personal, less about the route and more about a promise he believed waited above. Mingma didn't know the name behind that promise yet, but he recognized the force driving it. He had seen grief push climbers before. It rarely pushed them anywhere good. They reached Camp 3 at 4:30 p.m., hours behind schedule. Walter collapsed into his tent and did not emerge for dinner. Mingma checked on him twice during the evening, finding him conscious but distant, wrapped in his sleeping bag with his breathing shallow. Walter had a small fingertip pulse oximeter in his kit. Most clients did, and he tried to get a reading with hands that were already cold and poorly perfused. The numbers jumped and stalled the way they often do at altitude, useless until Mingma had him warm his fingers and sit up long enough to breathe steadily. The best reading they could coax out of it was still ugly. Mingma didn't diagnose him out loud. He simply helped Walter seat the mask properly, check the regulator for ice, and if Walter was going to use oxygen at all that night, kept it within the plan they'd been given. Because at Camp 3, fine and not fine can look identical until it's too late. That night, while the wind battered the tents and the temperature dropped toward -20, Mingma made his assessment final. In his experience, the American was extremely unlikely to survive a summit attempt. His body was failing in ways that willpower could not override. The reserves that carried younger climbers through the death zone simply did not exist in a 68-year-old frame that had already given everything it had. The math was simple and merciless. The summit was still 5,500 feet above them. The death zone began in less than 3,000 feet. Walter had taken 8 hours to climb 2,200 feet of fixed rope. He would run out of time, oxygen, and strength long before he reached the top. Mingma shared this assessment with Pasang and with Dawatashi, a third Sherpa who would be part of the summit team. They listened without argument. They had reached the same conclusion independently. The question was what to do with the knowledge. The answer, unspoken but understood, was nothing. Walter was a paying client. He had signed waivers acknowledging the risks. He had the legal right to continue until he chose to stop or until conditions made continuation impossible. The Sherpas would accompany him as far as he could go. They would not force a decision he was unwilling to make. Hey, quick reminder, if stories like this hold your attention, where experience, ambition, and risk quietly collide, you can subscribe to see more. Your support keeps this channel going. Now let's get back to the mountain. The summit window opened on May 17th. Weather reports indicated a 36-hour period of reduced wind and clear skies, narrow but sufficient for teams staged at Camp 4 to make their attempts. Climbers who had been waiting for weeks began moving upward, a slow procession of colored suits against the white expanse of the Lhotse face. Walter was among them. He had rested at base camp for 3 days after the third rotation. Under the expedition medic's supervision, he did a couple of short, low-flow oxygen sessions and one brief run in a Gamo bag, the portable hyperbaric bag teams keep for serious altitude illness. A stopgap meant to buy rest, appetite, and sleep, not fix acclimatization. The intervention restored some color to his face and improved his saturation readings. When he emerged from his tent on the morning of the summit push, he looked better than he had in weeks. His voice was stronger. His movements were more fluid. Ian Whitfield noted the improvement and expressed confidence that Walter was ready. The observation was based on appearance rather than assessment. It was enough to justify proceeding. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days, with an overnight at Camp 2. Walter moved slowly but steadily, pacing himself with the discipline of someone who understood that the real test lay ahead. He ate more than he had during previous rotations, forcing down calories his body needed, even when his stomach rebelled. He slept poorly, but slept, which was more than many climbers managed at altitude. By the time he reached Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet, he appeared to have stabilized. Camp 4 sat exposed on the South Col, wind-scoured and hostile even on good days. The summit window had delivered manageable wind, clear skies, the pyramid visible against the dark. Walter waited on low-flow oxygen while Mingma checked the equipment. The time for conversation had passed. What remained was execution. At 11:45 p.m., Mingma woke Walter and helped him prepare for departure. The older man moved stiffly, his joints protesting against the cold and the altitude, but he managed the familiar sequence of layering and buckling and checking without assistance. His oxygen mask was fitted and tested. His headlamp was activated and positioned. His harness was clipped to the fixed line that led up toward the triangular face. At 12:15, a.m. on May the 18th, Walter Brennan began his final climb. The first 2 hours went better than Mingma expected. Walter maintained a slow but consistent pace, his crampons finding purchase on the wind-scoured ice, his Jumar sliding up the rope with each deliberate step. The line of headlamps stretched above and below them, a vertical constellation of climbers, all moving toward the same invisible point. The cold was brutal, minus 30 degrees with wind chill, but Walter's layering held, and his extremities remained functional. He did not speak. He did not stop until the line stopped. He simply climbed. The balcony arrived at 3:40 a.m., a small platform at 27,600 feet, where climbers traditionally rested before the final push. Walter lowered himself onto a rock and sat motionless, his chest heaving, his head bowed forward. Mingma checked his oxygen supply and found it lower than optimal, the consumption rate elevated by the effort of the climb. He replaced the bottle with a fresh one, working quickly in the darkness, his fingers clumsy inside heavy gloves. Walter's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the climb. His movements became mechanical, and the coordination that looked normal at lower camps started to misfire in small ways. Fumbling his Jumar, taking a half-step sideways before correcting, pausing with his hand on the rope as if he'd forgotten what came next. When Mingma checked in, Walter's responses arrived late, sometimes several seconds behind the question, his brain struggling to keep pace with simple decisions. Pasang arrived at the balcony with another client and immediately moved to confer with Mingma. The conversation was brief and private, conducted while Walter sat unmoving on his rock. Pasang observed that the American was not going to make it. Mingma agreed. They discussed the turnaround time, the point at which they would be obligated to force a descent regardless of the client's wishes. The company protocol specified 1 p.m. as the latest acceptable summit time. Any later risked descending into darkness without adequate oxygen reserves. It was currently 3:45 a.m. The summit was approximately 4 hours away for a healthy climber. For Walter, it would take longer. The math remained unfavorable. The climb above the balcony steepened. The route traversed a ridge of mixed rock and ice, exposed on both sides to drops that disappeared into darkness. Walter's pace slowed further. He stopped every 30 steps, sometimes every 20, his body demanding rest that his mind refused to acknowledge. Other climbers passed them, moving with purpose toward the summit that was now tantalizingly close. They glanced at Walter as they passed. Some offered words of encouragement. Most said nothing. Everyone understood what they were seeing. At 6:15 a.m., as gray light began to illuminate the upper mountain, Walter stopped and did not immediately resume. He was standing on a narrow section of the ridge, his Jumar clipped to the fixed rope, his body swaying slightly in the wind. Mingma reached him within seconds and placed both hands on his shoulders to stabilize him. Walter's eyes were unfocused behind his glacier glasses. His breathing was rapid and shallow. When Mingma asked what was wrong, Walter did not respond. He simply stood there, staring at something no one else could see. This was the moment Mingma had been expecting. The altitude had finally overwhelmed the older man's compensatory mechanisms. His brain was starving for oxygen, his judgment compromised, his body running on reserves that had long since been depleted. A healthy climber would turn around immediately. Walter did not appear capable of making that decision. Mingma slowed his voice and reduced the problem to basics: time, oxygen, and the strength required to come back down. He repeated the key points until Walter's unfocused attention locked onto them. Then he gave the clearest off-ramp he could offer: descend now, while the margin still existed. Walter's response came slowly, as if dragged through fog. The summit was close enough that it had become an obsession. He fixated on the idea that stopping would make the entire expedition meaningless. He kept returning to the same thought, the same person, the same promise, something waiting at the top that mattered more to him than the risk below his feet. Mingma looked to Pasang and saw the small head movement that confirmed what they both already knew. The decision was no longer theirs to influence. They continued upward. The next 2 hours were a slow-motion deterioration. Walter's steps became shuffles, his feet barely clearing the snow before setting down again. His rest stops extended to minutes, then longer. He fell twice, catching himself on the fixed rope each time, his body crumpling against the snow before struggling upright with Mingma's assistance. His oxygen consumption accelerated as his body fought to maintain function, the bottles draining faster than the careful calculations had assumed. At 8:30 a.m., approximately 400 feet below the summit, Walter collapsed and could not rise. He lay on the snow, his chest heaving, his eyes closed behind his fogged glasses. Mingma knelt beside him and checked his pulse. It was rapid and weak. the heartbeat of a body approaching its limits. He checked the oxygen supply. The current bottle was nearly empty. One bottle remained. Other climbers passed them on the descent, having summited earlier in the morning. They offered assistance that Mingma declined. 2 more bodies would not make the situation better. What Walter needed was lower altitude, warmer temperatures, and medical care that did not exist above 28,000 feet. What Walter needed was to have made a different decision hours ago. Mingma made the call that should have been made at the balcony. They were descending immediately. He communicated this to Walter, who did not respond, and to Pasang, who began preparing the older man for movement. Together they lifted Walter to his feet and clipped him to the rope between them. He would descend supported, his weight partially carried by the Sherpas, his movements guided by hands that had performed this service before. The descent began at 8:45 a.m. Progress was agonizingly slow. Walter's legs functioned intermittently, sometimes supporting his weight, sometimes giving way without warning. The Sherpas compensated as best they could, absorbing the stumbles, maintaining the forward momentum that was the only thing keeping their client alive. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose from deadly to merely dangerous. The wind remained manageable. Small mercies. At approximately 27,800 feet, roughly an hour into the descent, Walter's legs stopped working entirely. He slumped against the fixed rope, his full weight suspended by his harness, and the grip of the 2 Sherpas flanking him. His eyes were open but unseeing. His breathing had become irregular, with long pauses followed by shallow gasps. Mingma recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, in climbers whose bodies had simply given up. They tried to continue the descent. Carrying an unconscious man down technical terrain was theoretically possible, but practically devastating. Each step required coordination between 3 bodies, 2 of which were exhausted, and 1 of which was unresponsive. The fixed rope helped, providing a guide and an anchor, but the angle of the slope and the loose snow made every movement treacherous. After 20 minutes of struggle, they had covered less than 100 feet. At 10:15 a.m., at an altitude of approximately 27,650 feet, Walter Brennan stopped breathing. Mingma checked for a pulse at the neck and found nothing he could trust. No steady beat, no rhythm that returned when he waited and checked again. He cleared the mask, checked the airway the best he could through frozen straps and layers, and called Walter's name, loud then louder, as if volume could pull someone back. For a few seconds he tried compressions anyway. More reflex than logic, then stopped. On a narrow ridge at nearly 8,500 meters, CPR is almost always futile. Nothing changed. Walter's eyes stayed open, fixed on the blue sky above the ridge. They sat with him for several minutes. There was nothing else to do. The mountain had made its decision, and the decision was final. Walter had climbed as high as his body would allow, and then higher, driven by something stronger than survival instinct, chasing a summit that had never really been about the mountain at all. Mingma radioed base camp at 10:23 a.m., reporting the death and their position on the descent route. Ian Whitfield received the call with practiced calm, asked for details, logged the coordinates, and confirmed that recovery would be considered when conditions allowed. The body would likely remain where it was. Most bodies did. The Sherpas descended without their client, reaching Camp 4 by afternoon and base camp the next morning. The expedition absorbed the news with the muted grief common to high-altitude losses, sadness tempered by the understanding that everyone on the mountain had accepted this possibility. An investigation later cited high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by exhaustion and age, and the company released a statement noting that all safety protocols had been followed. Mingma's earlier observations were not requested. In Walter's tent, among his personal effects, a weathered list of mountains was found, every name crossed off except Everest, beside which someone had added a short note in handwriting that wasn't his. The list was returned to his children with his wedding ring and photographs. They learned later that he had spoken often of their mother, that he had believed finishing the list would bring him closer to her, and that he had known the risks and accepted them. The mountain had not killed Walter Brennan. It had simply been the place where he chose to stop climbing. It was November 8th, 2023, on Manaslu, Nepal's 26,781-foot Mountain of the Spirit that rises like a deadly pyramid in the remote Gorkha region. Manaslu's avalanche-prone slopes and technical ice sections have claimed 67 lives since climbing records began, with most deaths occurring in the notorious couloirs above 23,000 feet, where unstable snow conditions can change within minutes. The mountain's isolation means rescue operations are nearly impossible, and climbers who make mistakes often die alone in the snow. Sofia Rivera was 20, a lifestyle influencer from Austin who had built her following by documenting extreme challenges and adventures. Her content focused on pushing personal limits and inspiring others to overcome their fears, featuring everything from skydiving to free solo rock climbing. She had discovered mountaineering 8 months earlier and saw it as the ultimate test of mental and physical strength. Jordan Blake, 23, was a travel content creator from Seattle who specialized in documenting remote and dangerous locations. His videos featured him exploring abandoned buildings, swimming with sharks, and hiking through war zones. Jordan had completed several technical climbs in the Cascades and convinced himself that his experience with Pacific Northwest mountains had prepared him for Himalayan conditions. Both influencers had arrived in Nepal 4 weeks earlier, documenting their acclimatization process and building anticipation for their summit attempt. Their plan was ambitious: become the first people to live stream continuously from Manaslu's summit, creating real-time content that would showcase the mountain's beauty while demonstrating that social media could inspire others to pursue their dreams. Sofia had limited high-altitude experience, but possessed exceptional mental toughness and physical conditioning from years of competitive athletics. She had completed advanced wilderness first aid training and could handle technical climbing equipment competently. Her understanding of avalanche safety came from a weekend course in Colorado, but she had never experienced the complex snow conditions that make Himalayan climbing so deadly. Jordan had more mountaineering experience, having climbed Mount Rainier and several technical routes in Alaska, but had never faced the extreme altitude and weather conditions of an 8,000-meter peak. His approach to dangerous situations was methodical and research-based, but his knowledge came primarily from books and online resources rather than hard-earned mountain experience. They were assigned to Dorje Sherpa, 41, and his son Pemba, 24, both from the village of Samagaon, whose families had been guiding climbers on Manaslu for 4 generations. Dorje's father had died in an avalanche on the mountain in 1998, and his grandfather had been among the first Sherpas to establish climbing routes on Manaslu's treacherous slopes. Dorje himself had summited the mountain 32 times and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read avalanche conditions and weather patterns. Pemba had 14 summits and was known for his ability to assess snow stability using traditional methods passed down through generations of mountain guides. He could identify dangerous avalanche conditions from subtle visual and auditory cues that modern avalanche safety equipment often missed, and had prevented numerous deaths by refusing to guide clients through unstable terrain. From the beginning, both Sherpas observed concerning signs about their clients that went beyond typical inexperience. Sofia's gear was high quality, but showed she didn't understand the specific demands of Himalayan climbing. Her sleeping bag was rated only to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, inadequate for the -40-degree conditions they would face at high camps. Her avalanche beacon was a basic model that lacked the range and reliability needed for serious mountaineering. Jordan's equipment revealed similar gaps in understanding. His mountaineering boots were designed for temperate climates and would provide insufficient insulation at extreme altitude. His ice axes were lightweight models suitable for technical climbing, but inadequate for self-arrest in the deep, unstable snow they would encounter on Manaslu slopes. Both influencers carried extensive camera equipment, including multiple phones, action cameras, live streaming gear, and portable satellite transmitters. This equipment added nearly 20 pounds of unnecessary weight and required constant attention that would distract them from essential safety protocols. They were more focused on documenting their experience than developing the mountain awareness that keeps climbers alive. On November 7th, Dorje conducted his evening snow assessment at Camp 3, positioned at 23,500 feet on Manaslu's northeast face. At this altitude, all climbers required supplemental oxygen to function safely, with tanks providing 2 to 4 liters per minute of life-sustaining gas. Throughout the day, he had observed troubling signs that his decades of experience had taught him to recognize as warnings of catastrophic avalanche conditions. The wind patterns had created dangerous loading on the slopes above, depositing fresh snow over a weak layer that had formed during the previous week's temperature fluctuations. Most concerning was the snowpack structure he detected through traditional testing methods. The new snow had bonded poorly to the underlying layers, creating a classic slab avalanche scenario where the entire slope could fracture and slide with minimal disturbance. The temperature gradient within the snowpack was creating depth horror, sugar-like snow crystals that provide no structural support and act as ball bearings between snow layers. That evening, Ang Dorje gathered Sophia and Jordan in their tent and delivered his assessment with characteristic directness. He insisted they needed to abandon their summit attempt because the avalanche conditions above Camp 3 were the most dangerous he had seen in 15 years of guiding. The slopes they needed to cross were loaded with unstable snow that could slide at any moment, burying anyone caught in the path under tons of debris. Sophia pushed back against Ang Dorje's assessment with confidence. She had been conducting snow pit tests all morning using her avalanche probe and shovel, finding consistent layer bonding throughout the snowpack. Her digital inclinometer showed slope angles well within safe parameters, while her snow study kit revealed stable crystal formations. She referenced her printed avalanche bulletins and weather charts, frustrated that scientific methodology was being overruled by traditional guesswork. Jordan backed Sophia immediately, his voice tight with frustration. They had spent 8 months planning this expedition, invested over $30,000 in permits and equipment, and coordinated with multiple sponsors who were expecting summit content. His entire brand was built on conquering impossible challenges, and turning back now would destroy his reputation as a fearless adventure creator. He had memorized every avalanche safety manual, studied snow science textbooks for months, and completed wilderness rescue training. He knew the theoretical risks better than most guides. Jordan was convinced that with proper timing, careful route selection, and their advanced safety equipment, they could navigate through whatever unstable terrain lay ahead. Ang Dorje tried to explain what he was seeing, but Jordan pressed him for concrete proof. How many avalanches had actually occurred in this exact location this season? Jordan had built his following by pushing past warnings that turned out to be overcautious, and he saw no reason this should be different. He wasn't being disrespectful, but his content creation success had been built on separating real risks from exaggerated fears, and he needed tangible evidence before abandoning everything they had worked toward. Pemba grew more insistent, his voice carrying the weight of generations of mountain knowledge. The avalanche forecasts meant nothing on Manaslu. This mountain had its own rules that killed climbers who trusted technology over experience. He had been watching signs that his father and grandfather had taught him to recognize, subtle indicators that the snowpack was ready to release massive slides with the slightest disturbance. His own uncle had died ignoring these exact warnings on this same route 15 years ago. The mountain was a loaded weapon waiting to fire, and Pemba refused to guide anyone into what he knew would become their tomb. Sophia remained unconvinced. She respected the Sherpas' experience, but their warnings seemed overly cautious, the kind of fear-based thinking she routinely overcame in her content. Her avalanche safety training had taught her to assess actual conditions rather than rely on worst-case scenarios, and everything she could observe indicated manageable risk levels. She had spent years proving that most dangers were mental barriers rather than physical realities, and turning back now would contradict everything she stood for as an influencer. When Ang Dorje refused to guide them higher, stating firmly that he wouldn't take clients into terrain where avalanches were certain to occur, Jordan announced they would continue with a different guide service. He had researched alternative routes extensively, understood the technical challenges, and had the skills to navigate avalanche terrain safely. His equipment included the latest avalanche safety technology. His preparation had been thorough, and the objective data supported proceeding with proper precautions. At 4:30 a.m. on November 8th, Sophia and Jordan left Camp 3 with a less experienced guide service, their headlamps cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as they climbed toward the avalanche-prone slopes that Ang Dorje had specifically warned them about. Ong Dorje made one final attempt to stop them, grabbing Jordan's backpack and pointing toward the loaded slopes above. He asked them to think about their families, who wanted them to return home safely, warning that he had already carried down too many young content creators who thought their cameras would protect them from the mountain's fury. Jordan paused for a moment, acknowledging Ong Dorje's concern. He thanked the Sherpa for his dedication and recognized that Ong Dorje was acting from genuine care for their safety. However, he had analyzed all available data and couldn't find objective support for the extreme warnings. He assured Ong Dorje they would be careful, monitor conditions constantly, and turn back at the first sign of actual instability. Jordan even promised to give him a special mention in their summit video for being such a protective guide, maybe even feature him in a dedicated post about the importance of local expertise. Their GPS trackers showed them moving steadily upward at 6:15 a.m., maintaining a measured pace as they climbed through the initial sections of the avalanche zone. By 7:45 a.m., they had reached 24,800 feet and were approaching the steep couloir that Ong Dorje had specifically identified as the most dangerous section. This narrow gully, approximately 200 feet wide and 600 feet tall, funneled between two rock buttresses at a 45-degree angle and was loaded with over 6 feet of unstable snow. As they climbed higher, they began noticing the subtle signs that Ong Dorje had tried to warn them about. The snow surface had a hollow, drum-like sound when they stepped on it, indicating poor bonding between layers. The wind had indeed created the loading patterns that the Sherpa had predicted, with deep accumulations in sheltered areas that showed clear signs of instability. Most unsettling was the complete absence of wildlife. Even the high-altitude birds had abandoned the area, sensing danger that the humans couldn't detect. At 8:30 a.m., Sophia's live stream was broadcasting to thousands of viewers as she documented their progress through what she described as challenging but manageable terrain. Her followers were commenting on the beautiful sunrise views and encouraging her to push toward the summit. She was unaware that every step was bringing them deeper into a death trap that could trigger at any moment. Jordan's problems began manifesting around the same time. His altitude sickness, manageable at lower elevations, was becoming severe as they climbed higher. His oxygen saturation had dropped below 75%, and he was experiencing the early stages of high-altitude cerebral edema. His judgment was becoming impaired, causing him to make increasingly risky decisions about route selection and safety protocols. By 9 a.m., at 25,200 feet, both influencers were showing signs of serious physiological stress. Sophia's heart rate had climbed to 170 beats per minute and stayed there, indicating severe cardiovascular strain. Her breathing became labored, requiring 5 to 6 breaths for every step instead of the 2 to 3 ratio that indicates proper acclimatization. Jordan developed a persistent cough that produced pink, frothy sputum, an early sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema. The weather began changing at 9:30 a.m., exactly as Ong Dorje had predicted. Wind speeds increased dramatically, reaching 50 miles per hour and creating additional loading on the already unstable slopes. The temperature rose slightly, a seemingly positive change that actually made avalanche conditions more dangerous by weakening the bonds between snow layers. Visibility decreased as spindrift, wind-blown snow, began obscuring their vision and filling their airways. At 9:45 a.m., while attempting to film content in the middle of the most dangerous section of the couloir, Jordan made a fatal mistake. He stepped off the established route to get a better camera angle, placing his full weight on a section of slope that Ong Dorje would have immediately recognized as a trigger point. The snow beneath his feet made a sharp cracking sound that echoed off the surrounding walls like a gunshot. The avalanche began instantaneously. A fracture line appeared across the entire width of the couloir with a sound like thunder, and the massive slab of snow began accelerating down the steep slope. Sophia, positioned 50 feet below Jordan, had less than 3 seconds to react before thousands of tons of snow engulfed both climbers. Jordan disappeared immediately into the moving wall of debris, his body tumbling violently as the avalanche carried him down the mountain. The initial impact knocked him unconscious as he was subjected to tremendous rotational forces that twisted his spine and shattered his ribs. His helmet was ripped from his head, his ice axe torn from his grip, and his backpack completely stripped away by the tremendous forces. Sophia attempted to escape by diving toward a rock outcrop, but the avalanche was moving too fast. She was caught by the edge of the debris flow and carried 400 feet down the slope before being buried under 8 feet of avalanche debris that set like concrete around her body. Her airways were completely packed with snow that had been forced into her mouth and nose by the tremendous pressure. The avalanche continued for nearly 3 minutes, carrying Jordan 1,800 vertical feet down the mountain before finally coming to rest in a massive debris field, covering an area larger than 10 football fields. He was buried beneath 12 feet of compacted snow that made movement impossible and breathing nearly impossible. The weight pressing down on him was enormous. Thousands of pounds of snow that had compressed into an almost solid mass. Jordan regained consciousness approximately 8 minutes after the avalanche stopped, finding himself in complete darkness and unable to move any part of his body. The immense weight of the snow above him made breathing extremely difficult, and he could feel the crushing pressure against his broken ribs. The cold was immediate and penetrating, and the silence was absolute except for his own labored breathing. His injuries from the avalanche were catastrophic. His cervical spine had been severely damaged, causing paralysis from the neck down. 6 ribs were fractured, with several having punctured his left lung, causing it to collapse and fill with blood. He had suffered severe head trauma from impacts with rocks during the tumble, and his pelvis was crushed from the rotational forces he had experienced. Sophia's situation was equally desperate. She had regained consciousness to find herself buried under 8 feet of snow with only a small air pocket around her face. Her left arm was broken in 2 places from the impact, and her shoulder was dislocated. Most critically, the snow around her was slowly compacting, gradually reducing the size of her air pocket and making each breath more difficult than the last. Jordan remained conscious for approximately 4 minutes, experiencing the terrifying reality of being buried alive while his body shut down from massive trauma and oxygen deprivation. As his brain was deprived of oxygen, his vision faded and his thinking became confused. His final thoughts were of his family and the devastating realization that Ang Dorje had been completely right about the avalanche danger. Sophia survived longer due to her smaller air pocket and less severe injuries, but her situation was hopeless. The snow around her continued compacting, and her broken arm made it impossible to dig herself out. She remained conscious for nearly 20 minutes. Her phone had been recording when the avalanche hit, and the footage from before the slide was later recovered by rescue teams and leaked online, where her followers watched in horror. The search for both influencers began when they failed to check in by a satellite communicator at their scheduled 11 a.m. contact time. However, the avalanche debris field was too unstable for immediate search operations, and additional avalanches in the area forced rescue teams to wait 18 hours before beginning probe operations. When the search finally commenced, rescue teams located Jordan's body after 6 hours of methodical searching. Sophia's body was found 4 hours later, both requiring extensive excavation to free them from what had become essentially concrete tombs. The recovery operation was dangerous and exhausting, with rescuers working in shifts to avoid triggering additional avalanches. The investigation revealed that Ang Dorje's assessment had been completely accurate. Snow scientists confirmed that the avalanche had been triggered by exactly the conditions the Sherpa had warned about. The snowpack analysis showed a textbook example of slab avalanche formation, with a weak layer of depth hoar providing no structural support for the heavy snow above. Both families struggled to understand how their children had made such fatal errors in judgment. Sophia's parents, who had always supported her adventurous spirit, found themselves questioning whether they should have discouraged her increasingly dangerous pursuits. Jordan's family was devastated by the knowledge that their son had died so far from home. His final moments spent buried alive in the snow while they slept peacefully in their beds, unaware their child was already gone. Ang Dorje and Pemba continued guiding on Manaslu, but instituted strict policies regarding avalanche safety decisions. Their standard briefing became clear. If the Sherpa says the snow is unstable, the expedition ends immediately. The mountain doesn't negotiate with content creators, and some risks cannot be managed through technology or determination. The incident highlighted the growing trend of social media influencers attempting dangerous feats for content, often fatally underestimating risks that cannot be overcome with preparation, equipment, or courage. Sofia Rivera and Jordan Blake, deaths on Manaslu, prove that some expertise cannot be questioned, and that ignoring the warnings of those who know the mountains best can turn digital ambition into a fatal mistake. Their refusal to accept Ong Dorje and Pemba's knowledge cost them their lives on a mountain that demands respect for wisdom that cannot be measured in views or verified through apps. The avalanche that killed them was entirely predictable to those who knew how to read the signs, but invisible to those who relied only on modern technology and scientific data. It was October 14th, 2016, on Annapurna's north face, where autumn winds were already stripping the mountain of its brief climbing season. At 26,545 feet, Annapurna remains one of the deadliest peaks on Earth, with a fatality rate that has historically claimed one climber for every 3 who reach its summit. Unlike Everest, where commercial expeditions have established relatively predictable routes, Annapurna offers no safe passage. Every approach demands technical skill, perfect weather, and the kind of judgment that can't be purchased or rushed. Base camp sat at 13,800 feet in a glacial moraine scattered with prayer flags and memorial stones for those who had never returned. The temperature hovered around 18 degrees Fahrenheit as expedition teams made final preparations for what meteorologists predicted would be the last viable summit window of the season. The air smelled faintly of kerosene and melted snow, and every gust snapped the prayer flags hard enough to sound like fabric tearing. Among the tents and supply caches, one small expedition stood apart from the larger operations, a 2-person Sherpa team assigned to guide a single American client who had arrived in Nepal 6 weeks earlier with more ambition than experience. Rachel Brennan was 34 years old, a former marketing executive from Portland who had discovered mountaineering 3 years earlier during what she called her reconstruction period. Following a divorce and the collapse of her corporate career, Rachel found herself without the life she had built her identity around. A friend suggested rock climbing as therapy, and Rachel threw herself into it with the same intensity she once devoted to quarterly targets. Within 18 months, she progressed from indoor walls to outdoor routes to her first high-altitude expedition on Aconcagua, the summit of South America's highest peak at 22,838 feet, transformed something inside her. Standing above the clouds, exhausted and hypothermic but triumphant, Rachel felt a clarity she had never found in boardrooms or counseling sessions. She proved to herself that she could endure suffering and still come out the other side. The feeling was addictive, and it rewired her sense of normal. Back in Portland, the office lights felt artificial. Conversations felt small. Ordinary life felt like a room she couldn't breathe in. Within months of returning from Argentina, she began planning for something bigger. Annapurna had not been her first choice. Rachel originally applied to several Everest expeditions, but was rejected by reputable operators who questioned her limited, high-altitude experience. One outfitter explained that a single climb to 22,000 feet did not qualify someone for the death zone realities of an 8,000-meter peak. Rachel interpreted the rejections not as safety concerns, but as gatekeeping by an elitist establishment that doubted women could perform at extreme altitude. She found a smaller Nepali operator willing to accept her for Annapurna, a mountain with far less commercial traffic and far less screening. What Rachel didn't fully understand was that Annapurna's lower profile existed precisely because of its danger. The mountain's technical demands and unpredictable conditions made it unsuitable for guided tourism. Climbers who attempted Annapurna were expected to possess advanced skills and extensive high-altitude experience. Rachel had neither, but she convinced herself that determination and fitness could compensate for what she lacked. She had lived her entire adult life believing effort was a substitute for uncertainty, that if she pushed hard enough, the world eventually surrendered. Annapurna was not that kind of world. Her assigned Sherpas were Mingma Dorje, 43, and his nephew Lakpa Tenzing, 28, both from the village of Manang. Mingma had summited Annapurna 4 times across a 20-year guiding career and had witnessed 11 deaths on the mountain, including his own brother, in an avalanche in 2009. The loss nearly drove him from climbing, but the economic realities of supporting a family pulled him back each season. He approached guiding with fatalism. Some clients listened and lived, others refused and died, and the mountain made no distinction between the deserving and the foolish. Lakpa had 7 years of expedition experience and had summited Annapurna twice, both times under his uncle's guidance. He was known for exceptional route finding and for voicing concerns other Sherpas often swallowed out of deference to paying clients. Where many guides learn to follow instructions and collect their fees, Lakpa kept a stubborn commitment to telling uncomfortable truths. It had cost him work with operators who preferred compliant staff, but Mingma valued his nephew's judgment over diplomacy. Both men recognized problems with their client from the first days of the expedition. Rachel's gear was expensive, but poorly suited to Annapurna's specific challenges. Her down suit was built for Everest's established camp system, but offered less protection for the exposure they would face on the north face. Her mountaineering boots were a half size too large, a fit issue that would become dangerous as circulation decreased, and precision mattered. Her ice axes were lightweight models designed for milder alpine terrain, lacking the durability needed for hard blue ice above 20,000 feet. Even the small details looked wrong in Mingma's hands. Too many brand new straps, too many untested buckles, too much confidence in equipment that had never been forced to prove itself. More concerning than her equipment was her technique. During acclimatization rotations, Mingma and Lakpa watched her struggle with basic crampon work on moderate ice. She crossed her feet while traversing, risking a snag and a fall. Her self-arrest was slow and uncertain. On fixed ropes, she clipped and unclipped her ascender with hesitation that revealed unfamiliarity with the system. These weren't minor gaps, they were fundamental weaknesses on a mountain that punished small mistakes with permanent consequences. At altitude, the brain's margin for problem-solving shrank with every 1,000 feet. The mistakes you could correct at 14,000 feet became fatal habits at 24,000. Mingma raised concerns with the expedition operator during the second week. He explained that the client was not ready for this mountain and that her skills were insufficient for technical sections above Camp 3. He recommended ending the expedition or hiring additional support. The response was dismissive. Rachel had paid, signed her waivers, and was legally entitled to attempt the summit. If Mingma was uncomfortable, he could forfeit payment and return to Manang. The financial pressure was real. Mingma's daughter was enrolled in a nursing program in Kathmandu that consumed most of the family's savings. Lakpa was saving for his wedding the following spring. Walking away from a $4,000 guiding fee was not a decision either man could make lightly. They discussed it privately and reached a compromise. Continue the expedition, but establish firm turnaround criteria at each camp. If Rachel couldn't meet the benchmarks, the summit attempt would end, no matter what she demanded. The acclimatization period lasted 3 weeks, following the standard protocol of climbing high and sleeping low. Rachel performed adequately on lower rotations, reaching Camp 1 at 17,400 feet and Camp 2 at 19,800 feet without serious incident. Her pace was slow but consistent, and she showed none of the obvious altitude sickness that would provide a clean justification for ending the expedition. Mingma noted she relied heavily on oxygen, earlier than experienced climbers usually did, but she kept moving. She was stubborn in a way that looked like strength from a distance, the kind of stubbornness that felt admirable right up until it became irreversible. What the Sherpas couldn't observe directly was Rachel's deteriorating mental state during long hours alone in her tent. She began with confidence, bordering on arrogance, certain her fitness and willpower would carry her through anything. But as weeks passed and the mountain revealed its scale, doubt crept in. Other climbers spoke casually about deaths on this peak. Rachel overheard stories of avalanches and bodies still frozen on the upper slopes, grim waypoints for those who followed. The words landed in her like a slow poison, and she felt herself shrinking under them. Rather than acknowledge fear, Rachel converted it into rigid determination. She had sold her condominium to finance the expedition. She had told everyone she was going to summit Annapurna. Turning back would mean returning to Portland as a failure, confirming every doubt she believed others held about her. The summit had fused with her self-worth. Reaching it would prove she was extraordinary. Failing would prove she was ordinary. And to Rachel's mind, ordinary was the one thing she could not survive. The weather window arrived on October 12th, a 48-hour period of high pressure that would provide stable conditions for a summit attempt. Forecasts showed winds dropping below 25 miles per hour on the upper mountain, with temperatures cold but survivable at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The window was narrow and would close rapidly as the next system approached. Teams that missed it would likely have no second chance before the winter shut down the mountain. The summit push began from Camp 2 on the morning of October the 13th. Rachel, Mingma, and Lakpa departed at 4:30 a.m., their headlamps cutting through darkness as they climbed toward Camp 3 at 22,500 feet. The route followed a steep couloir prone to rockfall once daylight loosened frozen debris from the cliffs above. Their crampons scraped hard ice, the sound sharp and brittle in the thin air. They moved quickly through it, reaching safer slopes as dawn light began spreading across the face. Rachel's pace slowed dramatically above 21,000 feet. Each step required 3 or 4 breaths to recover, and she stopped often on the fixed ropes. Mingma monitored her with growing concern. At this rate, they would reach Camp 3 too late to rest properly before a summit push. He halted at 21,800 feet and checked her oxygen saturation. The reading was 64%, dangerously low, even with oxygen flowing at 3 liters per minute. Mingma told Rachel her levels were too low and that they should descend to Camp 2 and wait. Rachel refused immediately. She insisted she felt fine, that numbers didn't reflect how she experienced at altitude, and that stopping would waste the weather window. She demanded they continue to Camp 3 as planned. Lakpa intervened, his tone firm despite the expectation to defer to clients. He explained that 64% saturation was a warning sign. Below 55%, the brain began taking damage. If she continued climbing and dropped further, she would develop confusion, impaired judgment, and eventual collapse. There would be no rescue. If she went down above Camp 3, she would die on this mountain. Rachel dismissed the warning the way she dismissed every obstacle in her life: divorce, job loss, rebuilding from nothing. This was just another test of willpower. She told the Sherpas to keep climbing, or she would proceed alone. The threat forced Mingma's hand. Abandoning a client would destroy his reputation. He couldn't physically stop her from continuing, and watching her die alone would haunt him far more than staying beside her. He chose to proceed, privately resolving to end the attempt at Camp 3 if her condition didn't improve. They reached Camp 3 at 2:45 p.m. after nearly 10 hours of climbing. The camp occupied a narrow shelf carved into the north face, protected from the worst wind, but exposed to the vast emptiness of the Himalayan sky. 2 small tents had been established earlier in the season, stocked with oxygen, fuel, and emergency supplies. Rachel collapsed into her tent and fell asleep within minutes, too exhausted to eat. Mingma used the satellite phone to contact the base camp with a report. He stated the client was severely fatigued and showing signs of altitude illness. He recommended aborting the summit attempt and descending in the morning. The operator acknowledged the message but offered no guidance, leaving the decision to the climbing team. That evening, Lakpa checked Rachel's oxygen saturation again. It had improved slightly to 68% after rest and oxygen, but remained below what experienced climbers considered safe. More concerning was her cognition. She asked twice whether they had already reached the summit. Her speech was slightly slurred, and she struggled to answer simple questions. Her eyes held a distant, glassy focus. These were textbook symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, brain swelling caused by extreme altitude. The only effective treatment was immediate descent. Lakpa explained it directly, telling her she needed to go down now or she might not survive the night. Rachel responded with anger. She accused Lakpa of sabotaging her expedition out of sexism, of assuming she couldn't handle the mountain because she was a woman. She was tired of men telling her what she couldn't do. She was going to the summit tomorrow, with or without them. Mingma stepped in before it escalated further. He told Rachel they would reassess in the morning, that if she improved overnight, they would consider a summit push, but if symptoms continued, they would descend. He didn't say that he had already decided to go down at first light, regardless. Sometimes saving a client meant making decisions they would refuse. The night at Camp 3 was brutal. Temperatures dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind rose through the early morning hours. The tent fabric snapped and flexed like it was trying to rip free, and rime ice formed along seams where breath condensed and froze. Rachel slept fitfully, waking to adjust her oxygen mask and fight the claustrophobic pressure of the tent. In fragmented dreams, She stood on the summit, surrounded by everyone who had doubted her. Her ex-husband, her former boss, the operators who rejected her, and a father who died when she was 19 without ever telling her he was proud. At 3 a.m. on October 14th, Mingma woke to find Rachel already dressed and preparing to leave. She announced she was beginning the summit push and expected them to follow. When Mingma protested that they had agreed to reassess her condition, Rachel cut him off. She said she had assessed herself and was ready. If they refused, she would climb alone and report their unprofessional conduct to the operator. The threat exploited the power imbalance of commercial guiding. Mingma depended on client reviews. A complaint could end his work with the operator and spread through the tight community of outfitters. He faced a choice between risking his livelihood by refusing an unsafe climb and risking his conscience by enabling what he believed would be fatal. Lakpa settled it. He said he would accompany Rachel regardless of his uncle's decision. He would not let her climb alone, even if climbing together meant witnessing her death. At least he could provide whatever help was possible and document what happened. Mingma had no choice but to follow. The decision had been made. What happened in the hours that followed is exactly why we document these stories. If you're here for the first time, subscribe to see more. Now back to the mountain. They departed Camp 3 at 3:47 a.m., headlamps illuminating steep ice leading toward the summit ridge. Above Camp 3 was the most technical section of the climb, demanding precise crampon work on 50-degree faces and careful navigation around crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges. The ice was hard and glossy, and every tool placement felt final. Even under ideal conditions, this terrain required flawless concentration. Rachel deteriorated rapidly once they started climbing. Her technique, already marginal, became sloppy on steep ice. She stumbled twice in the first hour, caught by the fixed rope but showing the impaired coordination that accompanied cerebral edema. Her pace slowed to half the expected rate. She stopped responding to questions. Her attention narrowed to the act of moving upward. By 6:30 a.m., they reached 24,200 feet after nearly 3 hours of climbing that should have taken less than 90 minutes. The sun rose over the eastern peaks, illuminating a vast Himalayan panorama and the enormous distance still separating them from the summit. At their pace, they would not reach the top before early afternoon, far too late for a safe descent. Mingma called a halt on a small ledge protected by a rock outcrop. He checked Rachel's oxygen and found she had burned nearly half her summit cylinder. Her oximeter showed 58% saturation despite maximum oxygen flow, a sign of severe hypoxia requiring immediate descent. Mingma watched her hands fumble with her mask strap, fingers moving too slowly. Mingma made one final attempt to reason with her. The numbers told a clear story. Her brain wasn't receiving enough oxygen to function. If she continued, she would lose consciousness within hours. Even if she somehow reached the summit, she would never survive the descent. The mountain would kill her, and there was nothing he or Lakpa could do at this altitude. Rachel listened with a detached expression of someone no longer fully processing language. After a long pause, she said she understood the risks and accepted them. This was her choice. If she died here, at least she would die attempting something that mattered. She asked whether they were going to keep climbing or whether she needed to continue alone. The question wasn't really a question. Rachel was beyond rational decision-making, her judgment compromised by the same swelling she couldn't recognize. Mingma knew arguing further was pointless. He exchanged a look with Lakpa that said everything. They were going to watch this woman die, and they couldn't stop it. They continued climbing. The next 3 hours were a slow-motion catastrophe. Rachel fell twice on steep ice above 24,500 feet, crampon points skittering before the fixed rope arrested her. Each fall cost time and energy. Each recovery took longer. Her movements became mechanical, her body operating on autopilot while her conscious mind retreated somewhere unreachable. The wind picked up along the face, pushing spindrift into their goggles and erasing small footholds faster than they could trust them. At 25,800 feet, less than 800 feet below the summit, Rachel collapsed onto the ice and did not get up. She lay face down, breathing in rapid, shallow bursts that failed to deliver enough oxygen. Lakpa tried to help her stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. She was conscious but unable to move, her body surrendering to conditions it had never been equipped to survive. Mingma made the call that had been inevitable since they left Camp 3. They were going down. They would carry her as far as possible and hope a lower altitude would reverse the worst of her symptoms. It was desperate, but it was the only plan that existed. Getting Rachel down required constant coordination. They rigged a makeshift harness system with rope and carabiners, lowering her down steep sections while controlling the descent with devices attached to fixed lines. The work was exhausting and dangerous, demanding precision on terrain that punished the smallest error. Every anchor point became a decision. Every rope movement measured against the possibility that one mistake would create 3 bodies instead of 1. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness. Once she asked whether they had reached the summit. Lakpa told her they were going down and that she needed to stay awake and help as much as she could. She nodded vaguely and closed her eyes again. They reached Camp 3 at 4:15 p.m., 9 hours after departing, and with less than 2 hours of daylight left. Rachel was unresponsive, breathing shallow and irregular, her skin gray-blue with oxygen deprivation. Mingma administered emergency dexamethasone to reduce brain swelling, but he knew it was likely too late. The options were all bad. Staying meant she would likely die before morning. Continuing the descent in darkness with an unconscious patient would endanger all 3. Helicopter rescue was impossible at this altitude. Mingma chose to descend until darkness forced them to stop. They would try to reach Camp 2, where a lower elevation might give Rachel a chance. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope. They left Camp 3 at 4:45 p.m. The sun was low, casting long shadows across frozen slopes. Temperature dropped rapidly as daylight faded, the cold tightening like a vice around exposed skin. Mingma led, testing each step on deteriorating snow, while Lakpa managed Rachel's harness from above. They descended 600 vertical feet before darkness forced them to stop. Their headlamps were enough for careful movement on moderate ground, but the steep couloir ahead demanded visual precision that the narrow beams couldn't provide. One misstep would send all 3 tumbling. The bivouac site was barely adequate, a shallow depression that offered little wind protection and none from cold. They wrapped Rachel in every spare layer and emergency blanket, forming an insulated cocoon around her motionless body. Her breathing was barely perceptible, each exhale accompanied by a rattling sound that suggested fluid accumulating in her lungs. Frost formed where the breath hit fabric, growing thicker as the hours passed. Mingma stayed awake, monitoring her condition and adjusting oxygen to stretch what remained. Lakpa slept in 2-hour shifts, preserving strength for the descent at first light. Neither man spoke about what they both understood, that Rachel would almost certainly not survive until morning. In the dark, surrounded by wind and empty ice, the mountain felt less like a place and more like a machine. Rachel Brennan's heart stopped at approximately 2:40 a.m. on October 15, 2016. Mingma detected the absence of pulse during a routine check and attempted CPR for several minutes before accepting that resuscitation was impossible at this altitude with limited equipment. She was 34 years old and had never reached the summit that had come to represent everything she needed to prove. The Sherpas secured Rachel's body to the slope using ice screws and cord, marking the location with a GPS waypoint. They descended at first light, reaching base camp by late afternoon. The inquiry conducted by the Nepal Ministry of Tourism concluded that Rachel Brennan had died from high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by severe hypoxia and exposure. The report noted the Sherpas had documented multiple warnings and recommended descent at several points. The client refused and insisted on continuing despite clear physiological warning signs. No fault was assigned to the guiding team. Rachel's body was recovered 3 weeks later and cremated in Kathmandu, per her family's wishes. Her ashes scattered in the Annapurna region she had found so compelling. Mingma Dorje continued guiding for 2 more seasons before retiring to open a small tea house in his village. Lakpa completed his wedding the following spring and eventually took over his uncle's guiding business, maintaining a strict policy of refusing clients who did not meet minimum experience requirements. The mountain remained indifferent to all of it, the ambitions and warnings, the determination and despair. Annapurna had claimed another life, as it had before and would again. The the snow covering Rachel's final campsite within days, erasing all evidence she had ever been there.